Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of the January Asian Hangouts. Today we have at least 5 guests, and we're going to talk about various topics and how they relate to reactionary politics and Asia in particular. So without further ado, I would like the first person, who is Gifu Gaijin, to introduce himself.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Gifu Gaijin. I'm an American living in Japan. I've been in Japan for over 10 years. My interest in alt-right, reactionary, I've been interested in race realism and human biodiversity for many years. It's one of the things that led me to Japan, in fact. As far as specifically alt-right, I think just in the past 3 or 4 years, I started finding websites and people and a chain of events that led me to Reactionary Expat. So, nice to meet everyone.
Nice to meet you also. And do you have anything else to add? You can talk a little bit more if you like.
Oh, I'm just looking forward to this conversation. I had a chance to listen to last night's Hangout. Different crowd of people, but pretty interesting conversation. So,
okay.
Thanks for hosting this.
Well, thank you for coming. Okay, Gus Faze, please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Gus Faze, and sorry, this is really the first time I've ever done anything like this, so hopefully I don't sound too garbled or messed up or anything. And so basically, my connection is that I'm married to a Cambodian woman and I also live with her parents. Her parents are refugees who came to the United States after the whole Khmer Rouge incident. And they've been living here for basically 20 years, and I've been living with them, married to their daughter for about 6 years now. And so I guess I kind of have the least connection to Asia proper here, so I kind of feel like I snuck in a little bit. So, but I'll try to be as constructive to the conversation as possible and add where I can. And I was basically introduced to the alt-right about I would say about a year and a half ago or something like that. I mean, I ended up, stumbling across Mencius Moldbug's writings. I think it was either Reddit or somewhere else, and kind of, just kept reading from there. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have come through the Mencius Moldbug route at all.
Yeah,
but
I did.
Yeah, and I was a libertarian before that, and I think it's easy for libertarians to convert, sort of, so to speak, through Mencius Moldbug or Curtis Yarvin or whatever, as everyone knows that's his real name. I mean, I'm not doxing him, I don't think.
No, everyone knows that. Yeah, that's the route I took also, and I was also a libertarian before that. I was sort of increasingly frustrated or unsure about libertarianism, and then I discovered Moldbug as well and was blown away by it. Yeah.
Yeah, libertarians will kind of put you off after a while as well. And the whole situation here with the Ron Paul candidacy, where they basically blocked him by calling him a racist, that was a real eye-opener, where they were taking like what I thought was essentially something irrelevant and making a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak. So like stuff written in a newsletter 20 years ago that has nothing to do with anything. Where it's not like someone was making racial, like, crazy race realist statements or anything like that. It was basically common, like, oh yeah, the blacks who were rioting in L.A. and after Rodney King were kind of animals. It's like, and then everything blew up from there, and they tried to connect every little thing they could. And that was basically my introduction to thinking more in race realism terms. But I've always been sort of a conservative person. Even when I kind of went through my libertarian phase, I've just always had that connection to, I grew up in Virginia and then Texas, and my parents were conservatives as well, so it's kind of a natural thing. But then I was kind of a drifter for a few years, and now I'm in Tacoma, married to a Cambodian girl, so it was kind of a long road to get there. But that's basically really all I have to say for my introduction.
Right, well, thanks for that. That's quite interesting. Okay, Lumen, you're up.
Hello, everyone. I'm American. I'm living in the U.S. Uh, Generation X. I am Caucasian, and my connection to Asia is my fiance is from the Philippines, and I've been over there a few times. I've spent some time there, and when I do get over there, it's it's hanging out in areas where I'm usually the only white person. So I've gotten to know Pinoy culture and the Pinoy ethos pretty well. Um, uh, Up until I guess maybe my early 30s, I just didn't really care too much about politics. And after 9/11 happened, I did a lot of reading about Islam and bought the Quran and just was appalled. And but I still tried to be a moderate. And but I had at that point realized how mendacious the media is and how dishonest they are, and eventually was able to call myself a conservative. And I didn't do any higher education until I was in my 30s, so I was away from that sort of insular environment where these the cathedral, so to speak, where these ideas are inculcated into the next generation of drones. So when I did end up going to school, I was just amazed at it's pretty much flat out Marxism, and eventually discovered Jared Taylor like the last 3 years or so, and learned more about race realism, and eventually I think I saw the Ramsey Paul video about the Dark Enlightenment. I just stumbled across it because I usually don't hang out on YouTube too much, and I thought it was pretty funny, but then I realized it was actually he was actually serious, and it eventually ended up checking out Millennial Woes like a year ago, and that's one of the primary things that brought me to what is called the alt-right. But honestly, overall, it's the church. I'm a traditional Catholic, and my fiance, she comes from a pretty traditional culture, and that's what really kind of brought me back to just traditional thinking and appreciating my heritage and where we come from. And I guess that's about it for my intro.
Well, thanks for that. That's quite interesting. I'm going to get Reactionary Ian to jump in because he's the next person on my screen. So, Reactionary Ian, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Ian. I'm American, and I spent about a year and a half teaching English in South Korea, and I've studied a little bit about the culture too. And I've been sort of gradually moving to the alt-right for the past 5-10 years. So that's the short version of my story, I guess.
Okay. All right. Anything else you'd like to
add? Nothing in particular.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your introduction. Tom?
Okay. My name is Tom. I have my own new YouTube channel for the alt-right, Right Turn Syndrome. I'm an American, but my connection to Asia is that I lived over there for a year in 2004 in mainland China, in northeast China specifically, in the province of Liaoning. I also was in Taiwan in 2006, and I was in Taiwan for 6 months. And I suppose I came to the alt-right as of recently, a bit begrudgingly, but I just felt that some of the things that the alt-right were saying was very true, and that a lot of ideas from the past before the Cultural Revolution needs to be reinvestigated and looked at again in maybe a new light. And Yeah, that's about it. And millennial woes was pretty much my introduction to the alt-right properly.
He seems to be quite a large figure, or quite an influential figure on the alt-right. It's hard for me to gauge because I'm quite good friends with him, so I think he's important, but he does seem to bring a lot of people over. It's interesting that he's an entry point for a lot of people.
I think he makes he does really good videos in that he makes a personal connection with you. Like he talks into the camera, he looks you directly in the eye, and you can I don't know, you get a better feeling from just the expression of his face. And
he's not like
a nice guy.
like a madman or nothing, and he's definitely not trying to like seem like he's smarter than everybody else or sort of push himself on anybody, and I think that appeals to most people.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I think he seems like an ordinary kind of guy. All right, so thanks for your introduction, Tom. And Zai, I should just say before Zai speaks, he's been having some problems with his microphone, listeners, so please take that into account. He's not deliberately trying to screw anyone around, so if his microphone's a little bit distorted, it's the best he can do. He's been trying to adjust it, but he might still have some problems.
Hello, is it still pretty bad?
Yeah, it's still distorted, but just see how it turns out.
Sorry, everyone, about that. It's the best I can work with right now. I'm not hearing the distortion on my end. I've tried testing it, and so I'm not sure where it's coming from. So I'm a English teacher in Vancouver, Canada. Right now, all my students are Chinese. Yeah, so I've been picking up quite a lot of Chinese recently. Of course, most of my circles of friends are also Chinese, and I regularly attend a Chinese Baptist church. Vancouver has really kind of, in terms of Canada, it's been the center of immigration from both India and China to quite a massive effect. But my plan down the road is to eventually become a teacher in China. So I should be moving over there within a year or two. My introduction to this kind of alt-right culture comes actually, again, through millennial woes. I came across his countless streams over the holidays and thought, no one else is talking about this. Maybe this is something to look into. And here we go.
Right, yeah. That's how it seems to be for a lot of people. I mean, he's produced an enormous volume of work so far
in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and it's also incredible the quality given the quantity as well. But I might be a little bit biased because I'm one of his friends, but I don't think so actually. I think a lot of people recognise both the quality and quantity that he's produced. All right. Does anyone else have anything to say in the way of introductions, or shall we move on to some actual topics now? No? Okay, I'll take that as
let's move on.
Moving on. Okay. All right. So the first topic is something that we discussed yesterday, but I think because there are a number of people who are different today, we'll have different perspectives on it. I'd like to know to what extent the changing geopolitical situation, that is the rise in China and the decline in US power, will affect various nations in Asia, from East Asia to Southeast Asia, the whole lot, and their relationships, those other countries, with each other as well. So would anyone like to talk on this?
I'll go ahead. Someone else want to go?
No, you do.
Well, I being close to the Philippines, the Philippines is a nation that's tied pretty intimately to the United States, and in many ways that's good, and in many ways it's not so good. In some ways it's in my opinion, it's culturally to their detriment. But for example, my fiance's father, he's pretty pro West. He's worked here in the U.S. He's served in our military, and I've heard him on more than one occasion lamenting that the Philippines didn't lobby to become, if not a state, then a territory of the U.S. And we do have we have had, a significant military presence over there, which should serve as a bulwark against potential Chinese aggression. But I will say, that the changing geopolitics, a lot of Pinoys that I talk to these days are, they're kind of freaked out about what's going on with China. And I think it was Andrew last night mentioned that when he was in Palawan, he noticed a naval presence, and that's right on the South Chinese Sea. And they just built an island, like right off. It's pretty close. I think it was about maybe 40 miles off of Palawan, and there are a lot of Filipinos who feel betrayed by President Obama, and they're feeling pretty helpless, because we have traditionally stuck by them. And I remember it was part of the discussion last night that the Chinese may be, seeing this time as their opportunity, because President Obama is not at all concerned about helping our allies. He's of the redressing neo-colonial sins sort of mindset, and so I will say that a lot of Pinoys are kind of worried about what the future may hold, and there is also a growing there's always been an anti-American sentiment over there, but the left does seems to be becoming more emboldened as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, it's particularly strange given that the US was going to make a pivot to Asia, and this pivot doesn't seem to have come, basically.
Yeah, that kind of gets in the way of taking care of social justice concerns here at home. So. Yeah. Would anyone? Sorry. Oh, yeah. Would anyone else like to comment upon the rise of China, the decline of the US? Perhaps Gifu Gaijin, how does that relate to Japan? What's the feeling of Japan?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think it was it 2014 or 15 they announced that the Chinese economy eclipsed the Japanese economy. Like, Japan had been the second largest economy for 40 years. They're kind of proud of that. And then just suddenly China is now number 2, Japan's number 3. And I think it hasn't actually affected Japan in a quality of life situation. It's more of a losing face globally. More intimate, what I'm seeing is more Chinese are coming into Japan, and they're not coming in as poor factory workers. They're coming in as middle-class tourists, because now they have a growing middle class in China. We can afford to go shopping in Japan. They're buying up a lot of electronics goods, and if you go to any of the major temples in Kyoto, you'll hear a lot of Chinese spoken. Culturally, I don't know if the Japanese are really happy about that. It's boosting the Japanese tourism industry, but Japanese and Chinese don't really necessarily like each other particularly much for any number of reasons. So.
Yeah. I think Chinese tourism is an enormous thing everywhere. It's certainly over here in Taiwan. It's an enormous thing, and there's a certain amount of it's a double-edged sword, because people want the money, obviously, but they're very unhappy with, firstly, the way Chinese tourists behave, because a lot of them are quite rude a lot of the time. and secondly because they feel as though China is using this as a way to steadily gain control over here. Indeed, there was an election yesterday in Taiwan, and the party that is sort of pro-independence, they got about 60% of the vote. They absolutely destroyed the party that's been in power for the past 8 years that has been sort of cozying up to China. So yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I noticed it when I traveled around in Southeast Asia as well. At Angkor Wat, for instance, there are tons and tons and tons of Chinese tourists there, and they're not necessarily very respectful to the locals, but the locals want the money.
Yes, I noticed that as well. I was just in Angkor Wat about 3 years ago, and there were lots of Chinese tour groups. I heard Chinese being spoken. In some parts of Southeast Asia, you'll just see a lot of Westerners, and you hear English, French, German tour guides, but now it's a lot of Chinese, Korean as well. The South Koreans are starting to travel a bit. But yeah, lots of Chinese. I saw them in Thailand at the airport. So they're making money. But yeah, not everyone really likes them in terms of their behavior. So
yeah. Would anyone else like to talk about that?
Yeah. In Canada, we've actually had an even worse problem than just the case of tourism. There's actually a large real estate market in Vancouver where it seems to be largely unregulated, and what's happening is a lot of the emerging upper and middle class in China are just buying summer homes in Vancouver for largely inflated prices. The result of that has been that the cost of living in Vancouver has gotten so high that no one can live here anymore, and everyone keeps moving further and further out into the boonies and out into the farmland surrounding the city center, because it's millions of dollars to buy a house down in Vancouver now, because these large CEOs buy homes and move their wives and kids there, but continue working in China, and the property value just skyrockets, and none of the locals make nearly enough money to afford the houses in their neighborhood. And rent prices are also skyrocketing through the roof, where if for the price of a suite in anywhere in Vancouver City proper, you could buy a house in one province over.
Yeah, a similar thing is happening in some Australian cities also. Huge amounts of real estate are being bought up. They're supposed to only buy new developments. So, a new apartment in a big complex that's just being built. They're not supposed to buy existing houses and so on, but they have ways of doing that. They'll have a relative or someone like that who will do it for them.
Yeah, I used to be working in construction in northern Vancouver, which is technically a different city, but it basically borders with Vancouver City proper. And I used to be doing construction there, and what I found is all of the real estate that's being built out there is entire acreages by these Chinese families, where on one job I was working at, we saw this huge industrial-sized crane at a house just across the street. And all the workers were wondering, why is there a crane going? What's that for? It's a house. And then the foreman told us it was to put in their chandelier. It's the amount of excess money these people have. It's just completely bloating the economy, and everyone's saying that there's bound to be a burst, a complete collapse of the real estate market in BC sometime in the next few years.
Well, I used to think a similar thing about the Australian real estate market, because I thought, it can't keep going up. It can't, this bubble has been going on for over a decade. But there seems to be no shortage of money leaving China. I think there are a lot of, they add enormous numbers of millionaires every year to their ranks, and so there's no shortage of money there. And I think a lot of those guys are starting to get nervous. They want to hedge their bets, so that they want to put some of their money abroad. They want to try to get residency or even citizenship abroad. And
well, where do you suppose all this money is coming from that they're gaining? Like, who's losing that's causing all of these guys to win so much?
Oh, well, it's because of the industrialization of China. All of these guys who have started businesses, factories essentially, producing anything that the West buys, an umbrella, shoes, stuff like that, all of that stuff that has been produced in the past decade or so has produced an enormous amount of wealth in China. And so there are enormous numbers of millionaires and even billionaires in China now. So that money has been building up over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And some of them are getting very nervous about the situation in China and have been for some time. And so they're trying to hedge their bets. I mean, they have 1.3 billion people, right? So Australia has a population of 23 million people, 24 million people, something like that. If only 1% of Chinese go to Australia, that's half of Australia's population. So it doesn't take very many people to completely distort a housing market in Sydney or Melbourne, for instance. And that's what's happening. And I used to think, well, it has to burst at some point because the average Australian can't afford these houses. But what's happening is the average Australian is just being relegated to the outer suburbs, and the prime real estate is being bought up by these guys. I mean, it may create social unrest, but it won't necessarily burst the bubble. Perhaps a similar thing could happen in Canada. I don't know.
Well, it is. It's kind of, I think, in some ways comparable to, you heard about the white flight situation out of London, right?
Yes.
You're seeing a similar case here where basically communities that used to be, largely, Caucasian aren't at all. It's at a ratio of like 90% to 10%, whereas all these families who are, more traditionally have lived here for decades, they're finding either that their properties are now worth $1.5 million, or that the rent is rising so high they've got to move out about an hour down the highway outside of the city. In a city like Chilliwack is the only place anyone can afford to actually buy a house nowadays. So it's this weird situation where if you get an hour outside of the greater Vancouver area in either direction, you find the population is 90 to 100% white, whereas within the city center, it's a minority.
Yeah, that seems to be a trend that's happening in any place, it seems, where there are large numbers of Asians, because they do have all of that money. They can just come in and buy stuff just like that. I met a guy about 6 months ago when I was in Australia. I was on a plane. The guy next to me just started talking to me. He was Australian, and he's done all sorts of stuff, but within the past 3 years, he's been doing property law. And he has, just in that 3 years, he's opened branches in every major Australian city. And he said they do all the sort of the contracts and so on, and they do some of the development as well. And they don't even advertise in Australia. So if they're building a new complex, they just advertise solely in Asia. They have display homes. So you walk into a shopping mall in about half a dozen different countries in Asia. You can go into Singapore or various places in China, Malaysia, and so on, and you just go into a shopping mall and there's an actual apartment. That's how it's going to look when it's built. They sell them all before they even start construction. They don't advertise in Australia at all. And he said a lot of these guys, they just come to him and they say, do we need to get a loan? And he said, well, you can if you need to. And they said, no, do we have to? Must we get a loan? And he said, what, you're going to pay in cash? And they say, yeah, just $1 million cash, just like that, just straight down. They don't get a mortgage. They don't even see the place other than in the shopping mall. They just buy it 2 years before it even starts building. And
when it comes to
in Asia, they don't advertise at all in Australia.
Right. Yeah, I've noticed a similar thing happening in Vancouver, where we actually do have a law requiring that all signs have either English or an English or French translation on them, so that the locals can understand. We've actually seen in several parts of the Greater Vancouver area that law is being completely thrown aside, and there are a lot of signs entirely in Chinese, signs advertising travel agencies and vacation services. And actually, a school that I taught at recently, it's an ESL school. They asked me, one of the first things they asked me is, what country are you from? I said, I'm Canadian. How did you hear about the school? Because they have don't advertise whatsoever within Canada. It's a very international, globalized market, especially here.
Um, yeah, it seems like there are a lot of parallels between Vancouver and Melbourne and Sydney, actually. There's
Well, is this? Do you guys think that? I mean, what this sounds like to me is, our addiction. I mean, I don't know about the economics in Australia, but or Canada for that matter, but in the U.S., this sounds like just our addiction to debt and just willing to sell anything tomorrow, for being able to go another day. Because I think of a country like Mexico. I could be wrong, but I think that if you are not a Mexican citizen, or even if you become a naturalized citizen, you're not allowed to build property, or maybe even own property. I can't remember, but and Mexico is, it's I don't know if it's a written law, but they're trying to maintain their Mexican character. So I mean, this is just this sort of thing is just madness.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, but would anyone else like to speak? I don't want
Yeah,
to
I'll jump in here for a
speak.
second. In Japan, there's also laws that restrict the ability of foreigners to buy and own property. But I know the Chinese have been buying up real estate in Japan. They go through Japanese agents, and I'm fuzzy on some of the details, but it is Chinese money with a Japanese person putting the stamp on the paperwork. So yeah, some Chinese are starting to move in as well and buy up apartment buildings and such, and office buildings in Japan. That's also happening here.
Sure. Would anyone else like to comment upon that?
I can just. Sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to touch.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll mute myself.
I was going to touch on a comment I think Lumen made upon about the buildup of the military in China, and how the United States allies feel betrayed. So I mean, if you don't, we can go back to that if you guys want to continue addressing the real estate stuff.
Well, I was just going to add in on the real estate situation here on the West Coast. It's pretty similar, but it's a lot more muted, obviously, than what's going on in, I think, Vancouver or in Australia. It's mostly just it's sort of adding fuel to the fire here in Seattle and a lot of major cities on the West Coast.
But speaking of the West Coast, I remember, this will go back 20 years, in the mid to late 90s, when Hong Kong reverted back to, mainland Chinese control, some of the richer honkies grabbed their money and they started buying up property, and I know Vancouver definitely, but also the West Coast of the United States, like Northern California, Oregon, I think Seattle, Washington, got a heavy Hong Kong investment, and they also were known for buying properties in cash. They would just pull out a briefcase full of money, like, here you go, I want to buy it right now. And Americans were pretty happy to get the cash. So yeah, that was major Chinese investment about 20 years ago.
Oh, there was into Vancouver as well, but it's not even comparable. It's the difference between within Vancouver downtown region. It'd be easier if I could show you a map. But there's within the core of the Greater Vancouver area, there's the Vancouver City proper, which is a small region. Mike's having troubles again. All right. Basically, it's several-fold larger than it used to be. I think the situation coming from mainland China is infinitely greater than it was from just Hong Kong a few years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, I think another issue too is that it was a different time period. I went to school with a lot of guys who were from Hong Kong at that time, but there weren't as many of them relative to the Chinese now. And secondly, there was a time in which the multiculturalism wasn't such a thing. It was very much about integration and assimilation back then in the 90s. And so those guys, they didn't necessarily form the kind of bloc, economic and power bloc that the Chinese are now. To me, it's going to be really interesting to see how people on the left square this circle with regard to multiculturalism, but then having groups that are extremely insular coming in and sort of gaming the system in that regard, and the fact that there will definitely be winners and losers. And the Chinese, they don't care about the fact that there'll be losers as long as they're not the losers. They're not on board with multiculturalism and all this sort of touchy-feely leftist stuff, except as far as it benefits them. But they don't care about other groups, and it's going to be interesting to see, well, firstly with working class whites, but other groups as well, how they end up feeling dispossessed or locked out of the real estate ladder and all of that sort of stuff.
The left will be happy as long as white people are getting hurt.
Right, but it won't just be white people who will be getting hurt. That's the thing. Because also, if the Chinese end up forming a new sort of, not quite an aristocracy, but something, some sort of fairly powerful and fairly hierarchical bloc, then they're not going to have any qualms about pushing that upon other groups of people. And I wonder to what extent that will manifest itself in politics. They won't play the multi-culti game once they've benefited from it. They will kick the ladder out from under themselves.
Yeah, when you mention the working class, I think it's only a matter of time, and not just the white working class, but you know, it's human nature, even among whites who, you know, have, you know, this fault of you know, giving it till it hurts, and you know, then giving for a while longer. I think it's only a matter of time before it becomes untenable, and it's sad that it might have to come to that, because who knows how nasty things could get. But I don't think they'll go down without a fight.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of working class resentment.
Yeah,
I don't know how that will manifest itself exactly, but I can see the growing social tensions a little bit in Australia already, and I think there'll be more of that in other places. Does anyone else have anything else to say on this topic, or anything else relating to the rise of China?
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump on that. If we're talking about, like, you know, Chinese investment in the U.S., for example, and leftist reaction, if the Chinese continue, say, building up if they start buying up property in, say, black ghettos in California and other places, I don't know how white liberals would react to that. You know, they can't, like, the Chinese will buy up property and displace ghetto blacks, and they won't be able to blame white people on it. So, yeah, I can imagine leftists really being kind of in a tizzy. They won't know how to react to that. And the Chinese won't care. They'll just keep buying things. And
that's right.
I think
there's no guilt culture there, so.
I think that's similar to how, like, the Koreans. I don't know if it's like people who live in South Korea, but Korean Americans have pretty much bought up the hair care product industry for African Americans, and they completely dominate that field. And there's like only a few companies left that are owned by African Americans, and they're really pissed off that the Koreans moved in and took over the entire market.
Well, Black Korean tensions, that's from like early 90s, Rodney King, LA. That has not gone away at all in America.
Yeah, and Asians in America are a favorite target of you know, wild urban blacks.
Yeah, no love lost between blacks and Asians.
Yeah.
Although I kind of think that might be starting to change, though. I mean, maybe this is just people on Reddit, but I am starting to notice sort of a new sort of progressive movement in some of the Asian community where, I mean, especially in you actually have a lot of female Asian YouTube celebrities who are very progressive, and, you know, and gosh, I can't remember a couple of their names. It's been a while since I've seen these videos, but it does seem like there is something of Asians not wanting to seem like the teacher's pet, like not wanting to seem like the model minority anymore, and almost sort of adopting a lot of black culture and a lot of things. And it's mostly a progressivism. It's not like they're really necessarily adopting black culture. Although I will say in the Cambodian culture in America here, you do have a lot of that sort of hip hop gangster culture. But for the Cambodians who were the descendants of refugees and actual like infant refugees themselves, I think it has a lot to do with sort of a defense mechanism where, you know, they came to the West Coast, they were transplanted here, and boom, they're in the middle of, you know, boys from the hood kind of environment, and a lot of them do adopt that, you know, Dindu ghetto culture. And I mean, especially with my wife's family, I mean, my brother-in-law, like, he's covered in gang tats, and he has, you know, TRG on his chest, you know, Tiny Rascal Gang. And especially in the 90s, that was really big. It's kind of starting to fade a little bit now. But there is that part of Asian American culture that I think is starting to emerge, you know, from the crevices.
And they were ignored. I mean, I remember, I don't know, maybe 2009 or so. There was an Asian student group, maybe in Chicago, and they were, you know, just being targeted left and right, and just, you know, physical assaults, sexual assaults, and they finally got some attention for it, and it was turned back on them. You know, it was the school superintendent was a black woman who, so I mean, essentially, even when they do say, look, you know, we're being targeted here, in some ways, I think because of their intelligence and discipline, Asians have kind of been, you know, cast into the role of, oh, they're with the white people, almost.
Exactly.
You know, but it's funny, I got to jump in here. Like, I've seen some Asian Americans who say they want to rebel against the model minority stereotype, and stereotypes are bad. But I guess speaking as a white guy, like, that's a positive stereotype. Oh, we think of Asians as smart, and they do well in the SAT, they start businesses. And, no, we're not all like that. Some of us are dumb. You're like, wait a minute, what? Like,
why would you want that? Like, why would you want to
shut up?
But that's our culture. That's, you know, that's what our culture is telling them. And I mean, this is what I meant earlier when I said that, you know, some aspects of American influence, cultural influence in the Philippines, it's detrimental because, you know, even just the short time that I've been going over there, I've noticed there's I think it's the Muslim guy that's running for president over there. He had a rally, and there were these, you know, young, I don't know, 19, 20-year-old Pinays twerking, you know, at his campaign event, and you know, it's disgusting, you know, and it's so, you know, I mean, you can only, unless you have really strong character, you can only hold out for so long against the pervasive culture that you find yourself in.
Degenerate Dindu culture. So.
Yeah, and it's
the slave morality, Nietzsche would say. Yeah, it's sort of unavoidable and it's irresistible. You know, you definitely, when it sort of turns into that Marxist dialectic, you don't want to be on the side of the bourgeoisie, I suppose.
Yeah, it all comes down to, I mean, one thing I figured out a little while ago is leftism pretty much comes down to being cool. You know, it's, you know, it's pretty facile. You don't have to think too much, and you're right, and, you know, people, you know, and if you're coming from a different culture, and, you know, you're just thrown into this maelstrom of otherness. I mean, how much resistance can you put up, and which might speak to you know, people like us who, if we do have kids, you know, we're kind of intermediaries, you know, between their culture and ours, and I'm assuming that most of us don't live in the ghetto. Thank heavens.
Not currently, but I did for a couple years, just because rent is cheap there. No surprise.
Yeah, I have to.
How's Mike, by the way?
It's still distorted.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have anything else to say about that topic, or I can propose another topic?
I'm good. We can move on.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the possibility of a Eurasian identity. I know we mentioned this briefly yesterday, but I think because there are more people who currently live in the West, especially people who have children, if they think there'll be a Eurasian identity that will begin to emerge amongst the children of mixed marriages and so on, and what implications, if any, there might be from that.
Just a real quick question. When you say a Eurasian identity, are you referring to mixed identity, or like sort of a away from the native land identity, like Korean American or Chinese American or
some sort of mixture between Western influences and Eastern influences. So children who grow up in a household where one parent is white American, for instance, or white Australian or something like that, and then the other parent, usually the mother, is Asian, and if there'll be any kind of influence there, because I've noticed that these families, they tend to be more conservative than the normal family in Australia, at least, where there's sort of a mix there. And I wonder if it's because those kinds of guys who end up marrying Asian women, if they're drawn to certain things, or whether it's Asia or their wives who change them, and the effect that will have upon the children and the political persuasions of the children and so on.
From what I've seen, that men in the West that get married, or from what I can see, that men that get married to Asian women tend to find something about a more traditional type of wife or marriage more valuable, rather than the one that we find currently here in the West. It's just why would you want to put up with the headache of like stuff that's that feminism has given us?
Yeah, I can wholeheartedly agree with that, and that's one of the most wonderful things about my fiance. I mean, she's a brilliant woman. She's extremely intelligent, and she could probably do pretty much anything she wanted to. But she wants to be a mom. She wants to have a comfortable, safe home, and in my situation, it's again. The Philippines is so westernized. So as far as forging a Eurasian identity, there are cultural differences, but I don't think they're stark enough to, and the way it goes in the U.S. and at least here in the U.S. is, as we were just discussing earlier, there's unfortunately a lot of the second generation kind of gets subsumed into the more degenerate culture, but I'm pretty hopeful for as things get worse, as people get lazier, and as unintelligent and morally challenged people produce more and more. I think that there will be a more a class of producers, people who produce, people who are interested in their culture, and I'm talking about Western culture. And I think that there is, and this is contingent upon a threshold, but there is a place for Asians in that. I think when there's a large enough group that immigrates. Obviously, that's, you know, and Germany's discovering this right now. A lot of places are. Then it's a problem. But I don't see a problem with a Eurasian identity going forward.
Well, I think Asians tend to make better neighbors overall. Anyway.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I just agree with both Tom and Lumen that I mean, just to build on what you're saying, I mean, and as Reactionary Expat has mentioned before, that he's not completely, you know, 1488 alt-right or whatever, and it would be nice to develop the idea that it's not about white people versus everybody else, but there are the races that have their stuff together, and there are those that don't, and there are those that are just sort of naturally and culturally designed for the sort of, you know, base culture versus a producer culture, as you said.
That's a good way of putting it. I was going to jump in, like, my own interest in race realism, how do I say, race realism and white nationalism overlap quite a bit, but they're not exactly the same. So, I mean, I have a certain first world bias, hence I'm living in Japan, not Kenya. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say Cambodians are also kind of in a league of their own, where, as in Asia, where I would say that it's kind of like they have a natural aristocracy where there's a small number of people in the culture who are very productive and very together, and then the rest are kind of more built for a sort of agricultural, more of a communal agricultural existence, which is why I think, you know, they sort of defaulted towards, you know, communism in a lot of ways, and they really still have a lot of hard time getting their act together, you know, in their own country of Cambodia, and even the transition into this country has been difficult for a lot of them, and which, I mean, a part of that has to do, of course, with genocide and just because they were developing pretty well up until you know, the Vietnam War and all that. There's actually a documentary about Cambodian rock bands in the '60s and how, you know, westernized Phnom Penh was becoming, but I don't know. It seems to me like you have that urban core, but then you have this large agricultural communal population that they're not in the same league as, I would say, in Japan or Korea.
Yeah, and that's a good point. You know, there is an Asian respect for hierarchy, and that's another thing that, you know, we can build upon with Asians. You know, if we're talking about a shared culture.
In Canada, actually, in the last election, we saw quite an interesting turnout as far as ideology goes, where if you guys aren't aware, there was a complete sweep across Canada towards Liberal voting, in that it was about 200 Liberal seats to like 90 Conservative seats and 30 NDP Socialist seats. It was a complete sweep to the left, with the exceptions being in Richmond, which is a city in Vancouver that's almost entirely Chinese, and a couple rural communities on the outside. You do actually see, and of course, a lot of these Chinese citizens are first-generation Canadians, so they are the direct beneficiaries of the really lax immigration policies we have, and yet they still tended towards voting Conservative because they saw it as a, you know, the potential risk of them not being able to get their family members across the border was worth all the gains and ideological positions they share with conservatism and, you know, right-wing ideology in general.
Does anyone have a comment on that?
I think we just figured out the secret to getting the Republican demographic vote back. We can just start getting Asians.
More Chinese.
Yeah, more Chinese. You know, that'll offset the Mexicans and South Americans. There we go.
If you think about it, it would be pretty funny. This is kind of a reactionary expat mentioned this in his Mahometanism video. You know, you could get these if we could get these Asian guys running. You know, any anyone who's looking to throw identity politics nonsense at them, they're going to be like, hey, I'm not white, I didn't do that stuff. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Anita Sarkeesian actually said recently-ish that Japanese men were essentially white, which makes her in line with Hitler, I believe, actually.
Among several other attributes she has.
I'm actually somewhat wary, though, of the idea that there could be large numbers of Chinese who would be natural conservative allies. I think they would only in as much as it would benefit them. But I think if they were a large enough bloc, they would probably do their own thing, or they would take Western conservative politics in a somewhat different direction. Also, the other thing that I mentioned last night is that I think there's an image problem for conservatism in the West for Asians, because they tend to be urban and they tend to be very cosmopolitan and so on. And they perceive conservatism as being redneck culture, whether that's right or wrong. That's how they perceive it. They think of it as basically being God and guns, essentially, and they're put off by those things.
Well, I think there's something else to take into account too, and knowing many first-generation Chinese Canadians, they actually have a real strong resentment towards like leftism, simply based on what's been passed down from their parents and their grandparents about the rise of communism in China. And you see the same kind of mentality in a lot of Eastern European countries, right, where countries who have been under the boot heel of communism and Marxism, they have this innate caution surrounding any movements to the left and towards socialist policies. I think that goes deeper than just what benefits me right now. I think they do have a strong safeguard against becoming victim to this kind of mindset.
Oh, sure. I worry, though, to what extent they would do one of two things. Either they could be kind of a fifth column for China. They could certainly influence.
That's a good point.
The various policies with everything from agricultural policy to other types of trade policy, defense, all of this sort of stuff within the West. Or the other thing is that whilst they don't like the left, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be allies of the indigenous white people in these countries. They would do so only as much as it benefited themselves. And I think if they were a large enough and powerful enough bloc, they would quite readily throw white people under the bus. And I think there are growing concerns in the West that a lot of white people just can't compete against them in education, for instance. And they will use meritocracy against white people. They'll say, well, we just studied harder than you. You're just lazy. Suck it up. And I could see that in some ways they could be allies, but in other ways they could actually be very bad for white people if there were too many of them in one place.
I would agree with that. I think Asian Americans are probably still pursuing a diaspora strategy. Like, they're only 6% of the United States, and as other people have mentioned, people still view the Republican Party as like old white people, and Chinese Asian Americans, well, we're not white, so we're going to vote Democrat. On the other hand, the issue of affirmative action really gets some Asian Americans quite heated up. It's like the one political issue that they'll speak up about. I think it was a year or two ago in California, 2 state senators with Chinese surnames, I believe from the Democratic Party, they went along with the Democratic Party's line supporting affirmative action, but then all their constituents, Asians in California, spoke up against it. And so these Chinese state senators reversed their votes and opposed affirmative action, and general white liberals were sort of confused, and they really couldn't see the racial element, whereas I guess as a race realist, I was like, oh yeah, I understand why Asian Americans are opposed to affirmative action. It works against them, but that doesn't mean they're going to side with whites. This is still a diaspora strategy. So.
Right. Again, in Richmond, in Vancouver, you do see a situation where they're quite culturally exclusive. You know, even when they're risking fines or imprisonment for not having anything in English or French at all, you see a lot of stores that are completely in Chinese. The people living there only speak Chinese. I don't know how they got into the country without being able to speak English, but they did. And you do have these entire communities forming where if you are not fluent in Mandarin, you're out of luck. And it's not. There's no resentment there towards the more native Canadians. They're just exclusionary and caught up in their own thing and what benefits their own culture and family and society.
Yeah.
Which is just human nature, which is why people like us gravitate to each other, because we recognize this and actually acknowledge it verbally.
If I can channel something like Kevin McDonald's work on diaspora peoples, what I see with, say, overseas Chinese, both in the West or Southeast Asia, is they are primarily economic animals. I don't see the culture of critique that Kevin McDonald described. Chinese overseas generally don't have a lot of political aspirations unless it affects them directly and personally. So there's no political culture there, per se. That may change in the future, given, though.
Well, they do come from a country where you're not allowed to vote or be political at all. Yeah, it's tradition to just completely wash your hands with politics. They're not used to it.
Good point.
At this point, before we continue, I'd like to introduce Dolph. He's been here probably 10 minutes or more, 15 minutes, I think. So, Dolph, could you please just say a few words about yourself? We can't hear. Hello? Okay.
Did you mute him?
No, I haven't. It seems as though his microphone is unmuted. Well, I'll let him figure that out, and then he can get back to us. If you could just type in the little chat on the side when you're ready, Dolph, I'll introduce you then. Oh, okay, he's trying. Okay, well, we'll just continue. Well, at this point, perhaps we could discuss race and IQ. Somebody mentions that earlier on as a potential topic.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Okay. Would anyone like to talk about how, in particular, because Asians do seem to have a slightly higher average IQ than white people? Do people here think that that's going to translate into anything meaningful?
One thing I want to start off with is that the IQ of the Asians, I would say Northern Asians, tends to be higher than the ones in the South. There seems to be a divide. Like even there's like a racial element, like with like Japanese, Koreans, and to some extent Chinese, a racial bias against people that they see coming from the South, like Indonesians or Southeast Asians.
Yeah, and the IQ map definitely shows a divide there.
There's a full deviation divide between East and Southeast Asians.
Yes.
So, full 15, 17 points there.
Yeah, no, if you actually take into account the IQ mapping that's been done in the United States, they have it just labeled Asian, and you can see it's already above everyone else. That is taking into account Southeast Asians and Indians. Just imagine if they just sliced it off at Japanese, Korean, Chinese. Oh.
Now, is this Indians in America? Sorry.
No, East Indians from India. Okay. They are considered Asian when it comes to any kind of mapping of white, black, Hispanic, da 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 da.
Okay.
Does anyone else have anything else to say on this?
Well, I mean, one thing to consider is that for Asians, in their home countries, and this is a dynamic that may be changing as China's economic might increases. Is a lot of them are, I think they call it brain drain. They're attracted to American or European institutions or hospitals, universities, etc. And I wonder how this affects, especially I don't know, a place like the Philippines where it's not like Japan or northern China. But over here in the U.S., I mean, there are a lot of Pinoy doctors and medical professionals, and they're really good. They're in fact, when I was over there the last time, I did just a wellness regimen thing, and the doctor was fantastic, and that's what he was saying. He wants to go. He wants to come to the U.S. and make more money. I wonder how this affects Asian nations. I haven't really read anything about it, but it's something I've been curious about.
Well,
sorry.
Am I still robotic?
No, you're better now.
No, you're good.
Cool.
Now.
Awesome. Expat, I remember he asked kind of if he thought there was a kind of a link between this IQ and Asians doing better in the West. I think, or if there would be, I think there already is, in that you can, along with the correlation between high IQ, above all the other races, you can actually see the average income for Asian Americans is above everyone else by far, to the extent where even if you take into account the gender wage gap, Asian women make more than Hispanic men and black men.
Well, on average, Asian women have a higher level of education and professional achievement than the other two groups you mentioned. So that's, not even surprising. So.
Yeah, and there's discipline in the culture. It's
it's not just IQ. There's a cultural foundation there. Exactly, that Confucian work ethic and Tiger Mom culture. It produces results.
Well, couldn't the culture itself, just encouraging a sort of striving towards intellectualism, just lead to a higher general IQ as well? Like, do we know it's necessarily genetic?
I don't think it's that appreciable. I do think it is a factor. Obviously, if you can have someone with a decent IQ, and if they, I don't know, play Xbox and hang out, sharing memes all day online, then they're not going to fulfill their complete potential. But it definitely doesn't hurt. But I mean, you see the same thing in the heritage of Europeans. When it's in the culture that you need to work hard and cooperate, or we're not going to make it. And if you don't do that, you kind of fall out of the gene pool.
Yeah, the Protestant ethic, which we're losing.
Now, jumping back to where someone was just mentioning culture and gene, my own anthropology research, I tend to fall back on the culture-gene coevolution theory. It's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture. Specifically with the high mean IQ of East Asians, if you go back to China, they were the first people to have standardized testing, the civil service exams for the imperial government posts. And so people who scored high on these tests were given high status. They were attractive as mates. We now know that intelligence is moderately to highly heritable. You fast forward 5,000 years, and people who scored high on these standardized tests tended to have more babies. So not surprising that East Asians do really well on standardized tests. So it's probably culture and DNA working together, co-evolving in tandem.
And it could be that people that are inherently smarter are perhaps more inclined to understand the correlation between working hard and setting a goal and following it over time.
Oh, there's definitely a positive feedback cycle. Like rich get richer. Yeah. Smart people get smarter. Smart people are more likely to pursue education, and they're more likely to become smarter and more successful. Yeah, there's definitely a Matthew effect there.
But and one thing, I don't know if we should bring this in, but is the difference between the creativity of Europeans and Asians. That's a different. That's an interesting, if nothing else, phenomenon.
Well, yeah, because although they have a higher average IQ, they don't seem to have as many outliers. They don't have as many really stupid people, but they don't have as many really smart people or creative people either. That seems to be a limiting factor, I think, in East Asia. They're really bunched around that mean, but that has positive effects, but it also has negative effects. I wanted to ask a couple of questions from the group. Firstly, who here has children with an Asian partner and or plans to have children with an Asian partner? And if you do or plan to what extent do you think you're going to put a very heavy emphasis upon education? And if so, have you been influenced by Asian culture in that regard, that emphasis upon education? So would anyone like to answer that series of questions?
Well, I mean, we plan on having children, and we put a lot of emphasis on education, and also on our faith. There's a and this is something that that we have in common. I mean, I was raised Catholic. I went through what many of us here in the U.S. go through, and you go through whatever New Age stuff and atheism, etc. So we will be, and those two kind of go hand in hand for us, because again, I'm traditional Catholic, and I every Sunday after Mass, and when I'm talking to people, I'm like, I probably see these people on YouTube, and we just don't know their screen name, and it's the same sort of mentality that a lot of us have. So, I mean, we will be putting a lot of emphasis on education and hard work and just values, just traditional values. And in my situation, at least in the Philippines, these are, these accord with traditional Pinoy values of working very hard, and if you can, go to school and just do your best. Enrich yourself as much as possible, and if you can, help others along the way.
My intention is to pursue that once I'm established in China, and as far as education, that's very important. Assuming I can, I find the education system in China or Taiwan, wherever, to be, preferable. I'm worried about alt-righters who seek this, who plan to have kids and plan to raise them to be academics in the West, where we do have such an ideologically overwhelmed university system, where all these universities are completely overrun by a singular ideology. How are people of more right-wing persuasion supposed to find a place to educate their kids?
Push your kids into STEM majors.
Yeah, and I think the university system is going to break down within the next 20 years, both because of the levels of debt and because of all of this ideological nonsense. A lot of universities are just going to become a laughingstock, and people are going to see that. They're not going to want to spend $50,000 to get a completely useless degree that's basically ideological programming.
And there are a few good ones out there. I mean, you got to research them. There's, here in the U.S. we have Hillsdale in Michigan, which, I mean, it's obviously not. You're not going to get a lot of reactionary thought. Although I wouldn't be surprised if some of the faculty there were reactionary. But there are a few bastions. But overall, I mean, it's a mess. And again, that's definitely one of the things that kind of brought me around, was when I'm grateful I didn't go to school when I was of normal college age, because I looked at a lot of these kids in these classes, and there were maybe one or two in each class who were just on board with the ideology and just passionate about it, and even intelligent, but most of them were just like looking to get through the class, and they were just drones, absorbing this stuff and taking it into the next generation.
Right. Well, a buddy of mine, he actually is currently finishing his degree in engineering, and he's at a campus that is exclusively for engineers. And even they've got all these kind of racial inclusion, sensitivity training, mandatory courses that he has to take.
Yeah, diversity.
As diversity courses as a prerequisite for engineering. And I do see a lot of that kind of crowd, even when their focus is just engineering, it's just STEM. They do still start to, they start to repeat the stuff that's getting drilled into their head every single day, even subtly. And every once in a while, I'll stop them and be like, "Sorry, what'd you just say?" "Oh, I just said that 1 out of every 2 women are raped by, like, huh? Oh yeah, racism is
how aerodynamics are sexist yet.
Yeah, stuff like that. And it's just. It just, when you're in an academic setting where you're supposed to be entirely focused on the subject and absorbing all this information, it's so easy to just sneak in little underlying ideological messages that the students just kind of adopt without even considering, like the implications. And I don't have as much hope for STEM being this bastion as I think some people would.
Yeah, that's interesting. In Australia, at least, I think it's still the case that university degrees are very compartmentalized. So when you apply to go into university, you apply to a specific faculty. So you do a Bachelor of Commerce or a Bachelor of Engineering, and a lot of things can still be done at the undergraduate level, at certain universities anyway. They're changing that a little bit, but you don't have to take subjects from other areas. So if you are doing science, you don't have to take anything from the humanities, for instance.
Well,
I wish it was like that here.
Sorry, what was that?
I said it's nice to hear. Yeah, it gives me a little bit of hope, just a little.
I mean, when I did my degree, for instance, things may have changed, but when I did my degree, it was very much like that. You did a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Commerce, Bachelor of Engineering, all of those kinds of things, and things like medicine were undergraduate degrees when I was there. I think some of that has changed now, but all of those things that you have to do at graduate school in the US, you could do it undergraduate level in Australia: law, engineering, medicine, architecture, those kinds of things.
Friends of mine that went into, this is talking about American universities, even friends of mine with STEM degrees still had to take it was the pluralism and diversity requirement. So they still ended up taking courses on, intro woman studies and oppressed peoples 101 and these sort of thing. And it always really got me that these really smart friends of mine, guys with degrees in applied statistics and mechanical engineering, would still spout race is a social construct and, men get paid more than women. And they would completely miss the bad math and the social sciences. I'm like, you're so smart. How do you reconcile these two things? I never understood that.
Well, fitting in is very important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I've theorized that. I mean, at least partly, that academics, they can, they can use this smokescreen, and they do, to kind of cover up shoddy teaching, and it's, it's kind of funny what, it's right in front of everyone's face. Like in these, what I noticed was in these classes where people, especially when it's not lecture time or whatever, when people have the freedom to associate, you always see, the black kids are hanging out with the other black kids, and the Hispanic kids are hanging out with the other Hispanic kids. It's right there in front of them. There's the concept of critical thinking is it's dead in academia.
It was replaced by critical theory at some point 30, 40 years ago. And no one wants to talk about that, but I can see the just vast chasm between those two. So,
if I could now, I'd like to move on to some other questions about Asia, actually being in Asia and so on. The first one I'd like to ask is, a question that was proposed by someone called Dan Breen in one of my comment sections when I mentioned that I was going to have these hangouts. And he asked if any of us have any opinions on this excessive conservative trait that Asians have. For example, the isolation of the Edo period, the burning of the treasure fleet, Japanese ban on firearms. And he wants to know if this excessive conservative trait could reassert itself as Asians admire or fear the West less, and how it could reassert itself. Does anyone have any comments on that?
I'll jump in on that. Like, I don't know if Japan fears the West so much as it fears China. So it's not even the West is not actually not that involved. But in the past year or so, Prime Minister Abe has been either trying to change the Constitution, Article 9, or trying to work within the present wording of the Constitution, basically trying to expand the self-defense force in Japan such that the self-defense force can go overseas to conduct combat operations in defense of Japan. Now, quite a few Japanese and all the white liberal English teachers are quite up in arms. They're quite angry because they see this as a violation of the spirit of Article 9. My white liberal coworkers are like, oh no, this is a return to fascism. To which I retort, like, having a military is not a return to fascism. That's just being a normal country. But again, I think Japan is reacting more to China than to the West. It's almost in a vacuum without the West, is my opinion on take on that.
Right, like expat, you're in Taiwan right now, right? So you'd probably be able to testify quite well to China's very what's it called? Empirical tendencies towards just conquering and imposing on everything around it. As I understand it from a Jongleur and buddy of mine, China claims at least to have upwards of 1,000 missiles continuously pointed at Taiwan in case they dare declare independence from Zhongguo proper.
Yeah, I don't think that that Asian nations are becoming less militaristic. I think if anything, they're going to become a lot more militaristic as the US becomes less powerful or less influential. And in terms of general conservative traits, I don't know. I mean, I think here in Taiwan, and I suspect it's the same in Japan, the youth are pretty left-wing. I don't see any sort of re-emergence of conservatism over here.
Well, my understanding, at least, of first generation and non-citizen residents from China here, a lot of young guys in their early 20s, robot, is that they're more anarcho-capitalists, which is still a very right-wing ideology. They're socially libertarian in some ways, but I'd still call them on the far right compared to anyone here.
If I can talk about Japan, I don't know if the Japanese millennials, I hate to call them left-wing because I don't think they have any political ideology. They're largely apolitical and apathetic. I mean, I wouldn't even say it's a conscious decision to pursue leftism so much as just, I just want to play video games and hug my pillows. So,
to what extent are they on board with things like gay marriage and other leftist social programs? And are they pretty left-wing on economic issues? Because that's what I see over here. I see young people here, and I think this has been confirmed by the election they just had yesterday. I think young people here are going to be an absolute mess when they're in power in the next 20 years. The party that just got in on I mean, part of it was being anti-China, but their platform is entirely left-wing on social and economic issues. And I see that the youth here, they're making up for lost time. Any notion that there's sort of conservatism here in Taiwan, that's going to be gone within the next generation. I mean, I know people get more conservative as they get older, but I think they're going to rapidly catch up to the West.
Well, I think that's kind of unique to Taiwan, in that they're a bit of a America boo. They're a bit, they quite like their Western trends. Whereas, at least from what I understand of the Chinese culture, even wealthy Chinese people and middle-class Chinese people and ones who've immigrated over here, first generation, second generation, they're still very conservative, both socially and economically, or they're anarcho-capitalists. But I think this trend towards leftism is kind of exclusive to Taiwan, which really does do everything it can to separate itself from mainland China and associate more with Japan and America, right?
Yeah, although I've seen similar trends in Singapore. Every time I fly through Singapore and read the Straits Times, I see little bits of it. And there's actually a website I discovered ages ago. I can't remember the exact URL, but if you just type in something like "this is Chinese privilege in Singapore," there's this whole movement in Singapore now of other ethnic groups in Singapore, and even some Chinese Singaporeans lamenting the fact that there's this sort of Chinese privilege. Every time I read the Straits Times, I see an article or two or some comments alluding to the fact that they need more social justice and more economic justice and all of this sort of stuff. Just one thing about Taiwan, the newly elected president, Tsai Ing-wen, she has been described as Asia's Angela Merkel, and she actually spoke in glowing terms about what Angela Merkel was doing last year during the so-called migrant crisis, and that just depresses the hell out of me. You know, if she's the Asian Angela Merkel and she's very on board with all of that stuff, I don't think
nothing
it
to be
bodes well.
proud of.
No, it's terrible.
That's horrible.
Someone's just written, "Don't worry, reactionary expat, you're in a safe space here."
Interesting thing I want to.
Sorry.
Interesting thing I want to point out about Singapore is they have no minimum wage. They're completely don't have it at all. And I was wondering, like, what kind of I'm wondering if that's like part of the social justice movement. Like they don't really like that no minimum wage law.
Well, also, I think taking into account the ethnic history of Singapore is important, because if you look at the social justice movement in North America, it's largely against the more establishment race, let's say, that's been here and towards immigrant minorities. Whereas Taiwan, for example, has a native population that's separate from the Han Ren Chinese, and I don't know, but I believe Singapore also has an ethnic population that is separate from the Chinese. So it would be more of them seeing this external force coming in, as opposed to an internal group bringing more and more and more foreigners into the country. It's they are more. It's like the inverse of the social justice we see in the West, where they're more isolationist, not less.
But it does seem to be a little bit contingent on, like, how closely a nation or a people tie their fate to another people. And I haven't been to other parts of Asia, but it makes me really sad when I what I see in the Philippines. It seems like it gets more and more pervasive every year. Just the idea of social justice, and these are people who, they didn't only live through 400 years of Spanish colonization, but the Raj under the British and other examples. They benefited from it, and were and also maintained their a distinct identity, and they adopted good Western values, and now everything. I don't know. And I think a large part of that is because they're closely tied to the U.S. and it's the more degenerate we get, the more it influences other nations that are close to us somehow.
So who exactly, in terms of groups, are these social justice movements in Asia rallying against? Because again, I want to know if it's an internal thing, or an external thing?
It's both. You'll hear, a lot of it is the U.S. When I was over there a couple of years ago, and I met one of my fiance's in-laws, and he fancied himself to be kind of an intellectual, and I was talking with him about something I heard when I was at university about what was it called? Cultural colonization. Where
appropriation.
Yes, no, it wasn't appropriation. It was the U.S. pushing, say like Pepsi, and media, movies and etc. And how this controls people by this is what progressives do. When it becomes clear that we're not colonizing people anymore, but we are, and we're doing it this way. The same with racism. You don't see racism, so now it's internal institutionalization. But anyway, going back to your question, it's some kids who get to college, and some of them become they might get work in the media or become. It's just like everywhere else. In the West. And again, this is the Philippines. It's very Western in character. So I don't know about other places.
Well, in Japan, what I've seen with some of the media, the English language media, is both internal and external, like Westerners writing to a Japanese audience about, oh, you should accept more foreigners, or you should be more accepting of foreigners, and kind of SJW liberalism, if you will. But then also some Japanese are writing like, oh, we should be nicer to foreigners. But I'm not sure how widespread I don't know if these ideas are really taking seed. I don't know if they fall on deaf ears. I'm not sure if it's really having much of an impact as of yet, but I have seen it in the Japanese media.
I think there's just sort of like the idea of the cathedral, where there's kind of like a self-organizing, like media, academia, etc. They all kind of form this coalition to push everything leftward, because it's like, from what I've seen in Korea, I think they sort of have this idea of what constitutes progress, and that's kind of the Western model of, we start out small, but then we become more prosperous, and then we become more cosmopolitan, then we become more multicultural, et cetera, and that's like the model of progress that they think they're supposed to follow. So it's like it takes time for that to develop, but you could look at European civilization 100 years ago, and they probably were very similar, but as the quote-unquote progress happened, it changed.
To what extent do people think that Confucianism is growing or declining, staying the same, and hierarchy and all of that sort of stuff with regard to Confucianism?
I think people still, I think it's still a part of culture. I mean, I can only speak to Korea. There are still very certain cultural things where they recognize hierarchy, such as how they address people, there are different speech levels within the language but for how you're supposed to address people in proportion to where they stand socially, and they still observe a lot of those things.
Are they being broken down in any way?
From what I've seen, I think that maybe slightly, but I don't know how rigid they ever were in the first place. But I've heard that sorry, there's some noise in the background somewhere. But I do think that, I guess I can't say to what extent they're really being broken down, because I don't know how strict about them they were to begin with. But I do think that there is some relaxation of it I've seen in different situations when I was there. But so you go on.
I would just agree with you that for the most part, I think it's mostly the same. That I don't really see it weakening or increasing as far as the Confucianistic culture, and especially with the sort of like this religion they have towards the ancestor worship. One of my previous students was remarking about how his family continually impressed upon him. You know, they have like a little shrine inside their house to the grandfathers and so forth, and how that has this special place still in their family.
You know, in Japan, I don't think the hierarchy is going away at all. I mean, even if there are any major socioeconomic changes in Japan, this is still a vertical society. You still obey your boss. So,
Yeah. Okay, well, I'd like to ask a couple of other questions. I think these were proposed in the chat. Two things. Firstly, if anyone is planning on moving to Asia, what would any of us suggest as a career move in order to move to Asia? I mean, I suppose English teaching is the most obvious, but anything else? And what would need to be done to sort of prepare for that? And the other one is, if we could discuss why there are different levels of crime in East Asia, because East Asian cities seem to be remarkably free of crime, street crime. You know, you can walk around at any time of night, more or less, and be completely safe. So if anyone could firstly address the issue of moving to Asia and pursuing a career here, and then after that we'll talk about crime.
Yeah, well, I should be moving there within a year or two, and of course I've already set up as an English teacher. We've got a pretty good network for finding schools in need of teachers, but with the risk that comes with this, I might be stationed somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Ideally, I'm aiming for Shandong, Shanghai, Beijing. Given that I don't really have much experience living inside the continent yet, I was wondering if any of you guys, who have more experience in Asia, would be able to kind of, give some tips of how best to survive there. Especially considering, I've heard you can't drink the tap water, for example, and a lot of the food is not necessarily trustworthy. The air is toxic, things like that.
Oh, there's a whole lot of stuff there. Specifically, I'd like to talk about actual careers, though, and perhaps also outside of English teaching, if anyone has anything there.
For ESL, I would say, like, if you're going to go over and teach English, one thing that's kind of important from my personal experience is be careful of if you get an agent, be careful of these agents. Some of them will screw you over.
Oh, no, I know about that. I'm not planning to deal with any agent whatsoever. I'm going to go directly to individual schools and see what they have to offer me.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you, though. Yeah, everyone who's been over there has already given me that warning. Don't deal with agents. Unless you are working for the agent company getting other ESL teachers over there, because that apparently pays pretty well.
Yeah, I've considered going to the Philippines to work. I do like it there, and as I've mentioned, it's Western enough that and I feel pretty comfortable there. But as far and I've considered we've considered buying property there at some point, but at the same time, there's the issue of stability. How who knows what's going to happen with China, and but if I did, I would definitely be looking to live in the country, in Manila, and Reactionary Expat mentioned crime. It's crazy. It's like it's almost like you have to be like high on cocaine or something just to be constantly looking around when you're out, especially if you're a white guy. And I'm pretty sure it's the most populated city in the world, either Manila or Mexico City, but it is crazy, and everyone's poor. It's and it's real poverty. It's not American poverty, where you have a smartphone and a flat screen TV, etc. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to live there permanently. I wouldn't want to raise kids there. I've never had any issues. I would say you should probably know how to fight if you're gonna spend time there in the city. But I do like it. I do enjoy being there. I like the people a lot. They're very congenial. They're very hospitable, and it's not fake either. It's a well, I'm sure it is with some of them, but they are good people.
I'll say a couple of things about those two questions. The first one, in terms of pursuing a career over here, I think it's very difficult because of the language barrier and also certain cultural barriers. They have a very different approach to work in East Asia. So it's not so much the idea that you turn up, you get your work done, you go home. You're expected to stay as long as your boss is around, and there's very much a culture of looking busy, whether you are or not is another matter, and being able to fit into a fairly rigidly hierarchical employment situation. It's nowhere near as flat, the hierarchy, as it is in many Western companies. That's a challenge for Westerners, and they can be very bureaucratic. They can be very set in ways that, even if they know that they're inefficient, their approach is, we've always done it this way, we're going to keep doing it this way. And frequently for Westerners, at least in Taiwan, if you go into a local career, then you'll get paid like a local, which is to say not necessarily that well. So I tend to think that for foreigners coming over here, if you don't go down the ESL route, you pretty much have to work for yourself. A lot of people start restaurants or something else that's in the service sector like that, hospitality. Some people end up doing export-import. That's a pretty difficult thing to break into, though. But another possibility in terms of coming over to Asia to work, and this is probably much more of a possibility in poorer countries, is to just set yourself up working online, because you can take advantage of the lower cost of living, and you can do work literally anywhere, or for anyone anywhere in the world. You can do that sort of stuff. But generally, I would say, at least with Taiwan, it's pretty hard to come over here and start a career, because why would they hire a foreigner when they can hire a local to do the same thing, who speaks the language, who fits in with the work culture, who's going to be happy to work on weekends, who's going to accept less money, all of that sort of stuff. It's pretty hard, I think, to come over and have a career that's either that's not ESL or working for yourself in some capacity. And in terms of the crime, I think East Asia seems to be very different to Southeast Asia. Taipei, for instance, is remarkably safe. And not just Taipei, but everywhere. I've been in very small towns, villages, everything, at all times of the day and night, walking around. There's no harassment, there's no sort of petty theft, all of that sort of stuff. It's really remarkably safe, and I think a lot of that comes from their Confucian background and the whole idea of having social harmony and so on.
Yeah, I would be a bit worried about the kind of fall of Confucianism and traditional respect in urban China, especially. I mean, you can even see the discrepancy in the language, how people speak to each other between the two countries. For example, if you know in Taiwan, if people say, "Could I have this?" You know, this, what was it, a 我想那个? Whereas, what do they say in mainland China, especially in the north? 我要给我. You know, there's no pretense of respect and traditionalism as much, right?
Yeah, generally here they would say 我想要. 想要 means I would, well, 想 is would like, it means other things too. 要 is want, so it's more direct if you just say 要.
Yeah, and they just say,
more like I would like.
Yeah, and whereas if you say 我想要 on mainland, they're going to kind of look at you like, oh, who's this pompous dude, you know? At least that's as I've understood it from my friends who spend much time in China regularly.
Well, when I was in the, sorry, go ahead.
No, after you.
Well, when I was in the north, it's more conservative in the north, so they're more traditional. So if you're up in I would say past north of Beijing, up in the northeast. It's the phrase "woxiang" is what's more popular.
Right. But yeah, that's in a more rural or smaller cities as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest city that I was near was Shenyang, and as far as I'm concerned, I didn't really discern any difference in culture between where I was at and that large city.
Okay, because as just I had heard is there's a lot more sense of casualness in Beijing Center and Shanghai, and they've also got risks of a lot more pickpockets and
Oh yeah,
things like that.
definitely. But if you're more in like more the back areas, it's definitely more conservative and more traditional.
Yeah, well, same here, right? You know, you go
Yeah.
into the more rural places in America and Canada, you're still going to see much more traditional and old style ways.
Right.
Perhaps, Gifu Gaijin, could you talk about those things with respect to Japan, careers and crime?
Yeah, I was just listening to the crime part. Crime is still fantastically and delightfully low in Japan. Even with 20 years of economic recession, there's little to no crime. If there is crime, it tends to be more like cheating husband stabbed by wife. I mean, like very little petty pickpocketing, that kind of stuff almost never happens in Japan. As far as career stuff, I've only worked in EFL for my 10 plus years in Japan. So it's the only thing I know about. As far as non-teaching work, some of the gaijin come over with finance if they work for a bank. I think there's a few IT people. But similarly, as you said before with IT, I mean, there's plenty of Japanese with IT-related degrees. Why would they bother with some white guy who doesn't speak Japanese and wants to leave at 5 o'clock? It just doesn't work that way. So a lot of us just kind of stay in the English teaching bubble. Because as soon as you leave that English teaching bubble, then you're not special anymore. Whereas if you stay as an English teacher, you're special. So I've always been an English teacher. Unfortunately, there still are teaching jobs in Japan, but the market is contracting pretty bad. At the same time, the supply is going up because there's just a ton of otaku that all want to come here and study manga or whatever. So supply and demand is kind of shifting against us. In the 10 years I've been in Japan, I've seen the job market shrink quite a bit, but there's still people coming over, so it's still possible to get a job.
Yeah, that's the case over here too. One thing I would say about teaching English, one of the things that I've done is you might need to do something in terms of getting a visa, a work visa or something like that. But if you do any private work, rather than doing one-on-one classes, do group classes. Set up your own group classes because it can be cheaper for the students. You can make more money, and it's actually it's more enjoyable. You know, if you do a one-on-one and the student is not talkative, it can be a bit like pulling teeth. Whereas if you have a group, there's a dynamic begins to emerge there. But definitely, if you do those group classes, you can make more money, and also you'll probably get more students because it's cheaper for them as well.
It's also more likely to snowball into running your own English school.
Yeah, well, that's...
Basically. Yeah. A lot of my friends did that. Marry your Japanese girlfriend, start an English school, and it started off with private lessons, 2 or 3 secretaries at a coffee shop, and 5 years later you have your own school with 100 students. So yeah, that happens a lot here.
The school that I worked for had me sign a contract that said I could not do that. They specifically told me, like, okay, you cannot teach outside the school.
That actually violates Japanese labor law, but a lot of the English schools here will put that in the contract, but it is illegal.
Well,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know what it is like in China.
I don't know Chinese law, so I can't say, but...
Well, the thing about the Chinese-speaking world is the law is always a grey area, right? So it's always a suggestion more than it's one of those things where if they know that you do it, they won't necessarily do anything about it until they have another thing that they want to get rid of you for, and so then they'll use the other thing that they have on you already as an excuse, even though they've been fine with it for 2 years. due to something else, they think, well, we want to get rid of this guy. Ah, okay, we conveniently have this thing we've been overlooking for 2 years. Now we can use that. That's how it works in the Chinese-speaking world. Laws are only enforced when you want them to be used for some other purpose.
Right. As I understand it, a lot of contracts are less than legally binding. So you pretty much got to make sure that you trust whoever you wind up going into business with. Otherwise, if they stab you in the back, you most likely won't be able to get any legal compensation for that.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. It's getting better in Taiwan. They do have labor laws here, but I mean, you have to be willing to stand up for yourself and go through the process and so on. I actually went through this process in the first year that I was in Taiwan. The company I worked for tried to enforce illegal things and take a big chunk of money off me, and I said, well, you can't do that. And I sort of dragged it out for about 5 months. I wasn't fighting it to win. I was fighting it to make them sort of lose a war of attrition, or to make it very time-consuming for them, such that they would realize that it was sure they might eventually get the money out of me, but it would take them a lot of time to do so, and therefore it probably wasn't really going to be worth doing it. But a lot of other people I knew at the time just caved immediately to them, or caved very quickly. So you have to be willing to stand up for yourself and potentially drag it out. I mean, it took 5 months for me.
And you continued working for them while they were trying to...
No.
Okay.
Well, it was part of when I quit. They wanted to take this money, and I said, well, you can't do that. And I'd already got another job and so on. But yeah, I mean, they try. Part of the problem for a lot of people is that their employment, that their visa goes through their job. So if they lose their job, well, then they lose their ability to actually be here, to reside here. And the companies know this, of course, and they hold it over their heads very much.
Right. That's one major concern for me going over there is, in order to get into China, I'd need a proper work visa, and that would be tied to my employer there, whichever school I wind up going with. And if things don't work out with that school, well, I guess I've got to either update my visa, assuming they allow me to, or come back to Canada at my own expense.
Yeah. I mean, they will use that in all sorts of subtle ways. They'll try to get you to do things that aren't in your contract. Oh, we need you to come in on Sunday to do a special performance, or we need you to come in and do all this extra marking or preparation that's not in the contract. Or,
And is there really any way to fight back against that, or just grin and bear it until you find a better employer?
I mean, I don't know to what extent the laws differ in China, but I mean, it varies from place to place. You probably just need to find a different job, essentially. Otherwise, they'll make your life very difficult in other ways.
Right. Well, when you came to Taiwan, did you require a work visa that was tied to your employer? And so
yes.
Did you have to? And so, if you changed employment without leaving the country first, were you able to update that? Fine.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so
yes.
that is doable. I imagine that would carry to mainland China as well. Okay, it's good to know.
Yeah,
so
it's 2 weeks, I think. You have 2 weeks. If you don't have a new job within 2 weeks, then and technically you're not actually meant to work during the time when they process your work permit and your residency permit and so on. But everyone does. But if you were to get caught, in theory, you could be kicked out of the country for working without a permit, if you know what I mean, just because it's being processed. But I think, let me think, I had 2 jobs where I needed a visa through those jobs. And the second one, I got married during my time at that job, so I just switched it over to a marriage visa, and that means that basically I could do whatever I wanted at that point. But it's certainly a concern. And over here, I think if you're here for 5 years, and you have to be here for a certain percentage of each year, then you can get kind of a permanent, or not, it's not sort of semi-permanent residency, where your job doesn't hold that sword over your head. But yeah, it's definitely a concern, and the more nefarious companies will certainly use that against you. The first job I had really did that to all of us, and that was part of why I ended up quitting.
Right. Well, wow. Go ahead.
I've got two more bits of advice about working in China, or at least from my experience over there. One of the things is when you meet other Westerners over there, sometimes some of them are going to be a little bit off in the head. So just be aware of that. Don't always just because I don't know, just because you come from maybe a Western country, don't necessarily just trust them because of that, for that reason. Another thing is, when you're walking in the street and you see these small little dirty children that are begging for money, try to get away from them.
Right, they'll steal your stuff, right?
No, like some of them will try to steal your stuff. But another problem is that they're being exploited by some older Chinese person somewhere, and you could, I don't know, like I was with a friend one time, and the little child like picked into his pocket, and he actually like hit the child as a reflex, and then he almost got in trouble because he drew a crowd and started getting the other Chinese people like mad at him, and he had to sit there and carefully explain what happened.
Yeah, you do need to be very careful about that kind of stuff. And foreigners over here, they can be really good, they can be really bad. Some of them can be on the make in some sense. Others can just have all sorts of personal issues and sort of drag you into a whole world of hurt if you get involved with them. And then, of course, there are tons and tons of lefties over here as well. Someone before was talking about the English teachers in Japan, white English teachers in Japan. Yeah, they're the same over here. They're very annoying. The thing about them is they all want to sort of comment upon what Taiwan should do, you know, how they should run society here. And they basically want Taiwan to become more like the West, but they don't want to live in the West. They don't understand that the reason they like Taiwan is because it's not like the West, but they want it to become like the West, which is kind of a bizarre thing.
If I can jump in here, Reactionary Expat, that's been one of my big observations and complaints is how many of the other English teachers in Japan are basically just, you know, politically correct liberals. But it really is a white supremacist view of the world, in I guess the classic sense of that word. Like, they're obviously projecting Anglosphere values onto East Asian societies, and they'll turn to me like, well, Gifu, don't you think that there's a lot of sexism in Japan? I'm like, well, you know, it's traditional gender values. Well, don't you think they need more critical thinking? Well, critical thinking is a Western thing. And occasionally I actually said something to them like, you know, you're really being kind of a racist. And they just freak out when you call them that, of course.
That's what they call it, the white man's burden, right? Oh, these poor minorities, we have to protect them from their own weakness, you know. Even if they're in a different part of the world, we have to save them from themselves. You know,
you're like, these stupid Japanese can't make their own decisions, so us enlightened white people have to help them.
Yeah, and they, especially, you know, guys who have degrees from the most prestigious universities in Japan in law or those kinds of things, they definitely need to seek the advice of some guy who teaches English to 8-year-olds.
Yeah, like, who the hell are you?
Funny. Well, it's funny how they pick and choose. You know, they'll meddle in something like this, but you know, I know someone who and they're pretty far left, and they teach in Saudi Arabia, and I'm pretty certain that, you know, she's all hijabbed up, you know, when she's over there teaching, and doesn't really you know, bring too much criticism to bear about about women's rights, and it happens. Again, even in Europe, as we saw in Germany.
Well, for example, I've seen some Westerners who taught in places like Cambodia and Thailand specifically, and again, they have that kind of Eurocentric projection. They complain about every aspect of that culture, but then when it comes to the availability of prostitutes in those societies, oh, that aspect of the culture you like. Oh, suddenly, oh yeah, Thailand's great, isn't it? You know, but oh yeah, they're so backwards, they're blah, 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 but, you know, Lower Sukhumvit, I like that. So yeah, there's some inconsistency there. You know?
Well, I mean, the progressive view of multiculturalism is pretty backwards and hypocritical to me, just because it's basically like we're going to enjoy everybody's differences by making everybody the same and displacing everyone from, you know, everyone's not going to have a homeland. It's just going to be, well, one world and one people, but yet there's going to be this diversity, and it's like, so there's going to be different names and different styles of food and clothing and music, but everyone's essentially going to be the same person, and there's not going to be any cultural differences, because that would involve some level of racism or the other or something like that.
They just want to make everybody hipsters and metrosexual with sexuals.
Exactly.
It's all reductive. I mean, every aspect of their worldview, you know, comes down to one thing. You know, it's a leveling, you know, of everything down to mediocrity. And you know, I can't really speak with authority on it, but I think a very prudent part of the British Empire was, and Edmund Burke talked about it and recommended it, was, you know, letting these, you know, within, you know, following within the parameters by which the British would profit from these empires, letting these cultures be themselves, and you know, and I mean, there were, you know, the caste system in India was, you know, systematically chipped away at, but you know, largely just letting these people be who they are, you know. And it's like, yeah, there is imperialism, and you know, we're controlling things here, but they weren't. It wasn't a, you know, like what we see right now with the leftist cultural view.
Right. It's the same reason, actually, that England has historically a very deep resentment of France, you know, dating back to William the Conqueror. Because what did he do? He conquered England and then oppressed the English culture with French culture. What you don't hear about is the same level of vilification towards the Danish, who conquered England a couple of decades before that, because they completely stayed laissez-faire to English culture. And they're the same conquest and complete ethnic, you know, oppression that you saw from the French that led to the 100 Years' War, and this long rivalry between English and French that still, you hear people making jokes about, oh, stuff the French today, wasn't present. It isn't present between England and Denmark, despite all the genocide and rape that occurred over thousands of years, because there wasn't that sense of conquering and destroying their culture. It was very respectful, but still, of course, you know, we're on top, you're on the bottom, but we'll let you do your thing. Now, that's a bit off topic, I know.
Is my mic okay?
Yeah, you sound okay to me.
Okay.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment any more on what we've been discussing, or shall we move on to another topic?
I just want to add one thing, and this is like one of the reasons why I don't think multiculturalism is going. Another reason why multiculturalism is not going to work in China, and that's because they had a recent history about 150 years ago, where they had foreigners basically come into their land and impose all kinds of things, and they eventually got rid of them with the Communist Cultural Revolution. They're not going to want to go through that again.
Yeah, I suspect they won't. That would be devastating. It would set them back decades. It would undo everything that they've been doing for the past 2 or 3 decades.
It is interesting that prior to the rise of China,
that you did actually see a choice being set up between two cultures, neither of which were Chinese, right? There was the imperialism coming from Japan. That failed and led to the rise of communism, which was distinctly Russian in its culture and its ideology. And you had these Chinese citizens adopting Russian tradition and culture as their own, which kind of turned China into that big, meat grinding machine that eventually led to its uprising in modern day.
Yeah, I would say describing it as distinctly Russian is not entirely accurate, if you know what I'm getting at. But other than that, I agree with you for sure.
Well,
I would.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I would say Mao took the ideas of communism and then he made it distinctly a Chinese version, agrarian type communism that was very nationalistic in nature.
Well, nationalistic towards communism itself, because you did see the abolition of a lot of Chinese historical relics and traditions and languages and culture. He was very much in favor of destroying a lot of what historically made China China. And as I understand it, when the communist revolution was starting in China, they did get a lot of support directly from Russia, and they were calling each other comrade, and using Chinesified terms that originated from the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, they were definitely friends at first.
So it's interesting to see that they're, I don't know, just that this sort of imperialism coming from communism has sort of really washed out a lot of what was traditional Chinese culture, I think.
Oh yeah, I agree. I was just saying that communism I don't think is entirely Russian. I think it was Karl Marx and many of the early communists were basically Jewish. And I think that it wasn't really Russian, but it came from Russia, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting take on it.
In the road to serfdom. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, sorry. Go.
In the road to serfdom from F.A. Hayek, he basically wrote that it started in Germany, probably with Jewish connections. Although I don't think he went into that angle too much.
Yeah, it's like Reactionary Expat was saying, or I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, that Asians will take things that were started by Europeans and make it better and more efficient, and that's kind of what the Chinese did. They took this aberrant ideology and in China. I mean, they even adapted capitalism to communism.
But that seems to be something. Sorry.
I wouldn't say they made it better. They just made it more.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I mean, I don't consider it objectively better, but they made it work better. They made it. I mean, they're still around, and Soviet Russia isn't.
Yeah.
Sorry if I can jump in here. What I was going to say with some of the communism is the Asian communism still had these kind of nationalistic impulses, despite their ideological claims. Like Ho Chi Minh was trying to save Vietnam from Western imperialism, etc. And so, in many ways, like Asian communism didn't have the same internationalism as the more echoey Western form of communism, shall we say. There was still something very nationalistic about even Pol Pot, who borrowed heavily from Mao Zedong, etc. It was protecting one nation.
No, that's very true, and I think a lot of that probably dates back to how communism came to power in China, where in Russia it started out as a people's movement to overthrow the government and kind of was based around this idea of it's all of the world against the ruling class, whereas the only reason Mao was able to take power was because all of China was unified it was us against them being Japan. So there was this very nationalistic sense. So it's sort of like a bastardized version, I think, of Marx's dream. But I think it was probably achieved a lot more successfully in China than it was in Russia, with just really the complete abolition of the idea of self, where you saw people wearing the Mao suit with this asexual military green getup and just But I do think that bastardization probably came from the war that allowed communism to take power in the first place.
And it just fits with their psyche. It really does.
That's true. Yeah, they're much less individualistic anyway. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no. If you want to keep talking about this, you guys can. I was just going to segue into another topic.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Someone, was it you, Tom? I'm not sure. Someone brought up earlier, I think before the Hangout started, the idea that Westerners, they're more pan-nationalistic in that people in America or people in various European countries feel threatened if they see another Western white country potentially falling apart. Whereas in East Asia, if China were to fall apart and be swamped by immigrants, Koreans or Japanese wouldn't necessarily care one way or the other. Was that you, Tom, who mentioned that topic? And perhaps you could explain it a little bit more.
Okay, so I was basically talking with Andrew, who was in the last Hangout, and he asked me a question, and he was like, he asked me, he wanted to know why.
And he's Korean, right?
Yeah, he's South Korean, and he wanted to know why I care so much about what happens to Europeans, but Germans or British people or Polish people or whoever over in Europe. And he didn't understand, like, why do I care if the Muslim migrants go over there? Because to him, to most Asian people, that they don't identify the same way. So if, like, say the Japanese were being overrun by bloodthirsty Muslim Klingons or whatever, they just really wouldn't care, and there just would not be this sort of I guess like a sense of brotherhood or a sense of connection to those people.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I think it's, we're white, and it's almost, I mean, you can almost make the analogy of, Europe is a home, like literally a home. It's like where we keep our really good stuff. I mean, everything that our culture achieved, which is a lot, up until we began spreading out into the Anglosphere and in some respects into even places like Latin America, but it's where everything, it's where you go to see the great art, to see the architecture, to if you're in an honest program learning about great music, you're going to end up in Europe, and that's with China and Korea, these are very distinct cultures. It's like they do have they do have more in common genetically than they do with, I don't know, say Indians or Aborigines, but they see themselves as very distinct, and they see Korean accomplishments as having nothing to do with Chinese, and vice versa.
Sorry, please. Oh, okay. I was going to say, like, I think also Westerners tend to have a broader perspective of things. There's more of a meta-level analysis, more of a civilizational analysis. Like, we're the ones who came up with social sciences. So an American such as myself watching things happening in England and Germany, I do have an emotional reaction because, like, yeah, like you said, that's where we keep stuff. That is the center of Western civilization. Whereas I don't think generally Asians have that same broader perspective. They only focus on their more smaller circles, smaller focus. And so even things like, slightly off topic here, like urban planning. In the West, we actually try to design neighborhoods that are have a certain continuity and theme and how many houses can you build, whereas urban planning really doesn't exist much in Japan. We're just going to shove houses in every single square inch of land we possibly can, and the end result are sort of, higgledy-piggledy jumbled neighborhoods and roads that don't go anywhere. Whereas in the West, there's kind of a sense of designing a neighborhood, and I think that could be projected to some of our social, the social aspect as well.
I wonder if it might have to do with sort of where we come from. Americans and Canadians, we're colonial nations originally from Europe, right? Ben, like again. I can go ahead, someone else.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting then that Tom was speaking to Andrew about this, and Andrew said that he couldn't really fathom why white people see this sort of collection of nations as all being related. Because at least over here, there's there are a couple of catch-all names they have for white people. They either call them Waigoran, which just means outside people, or they'll even refer to them broadly as all being American. And I was overseas with my wife. We were in Europe, and we're walking along, and my wife said something about, the foreigners here do a particular thing. And I said, what do you mean foreigners? And she said, the foreigners. I said, no, they're not the foreigners here. We're the foreigners. You're a foreigner here. And she had never thought of that before, that foreigner could be her, that she could be a foreigner. And I think there is, at some level, something in this, in the way that they view white people here as all being the same. Like they'll just go up to a white person and assume that white person speaks English, or assume that that white person is even American. So it's strange to me that they wouldn't then understand why white people would potentially see themselves as being related in that, or have common interests.
One question I would have about that is, like, when did white people sort of get that kind of pan-nationalistic feeling? Like, if you went back several centuries, would say the French care anything about the Germans, or is that something that kind of develops from a more modern perspective?
As far as I know, we've always kind of had this large group identity, even dating back to the post-Roman Empire, but we were more tied to Scandinavia, where it used to be 1,000 years ago, like around the year 1000, English, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and German to an extent. These languages were mutually intelligible. The word for dead body in English was Lich. The word in German was Lich. The word in Swedish was, Leich. They were all mutually intelligible languages. There was this sense. Did I say Dutch? I meant Danish. Oh, or Dutch, yeah. And you get these kind of, because they all descended from the same Germanic tribes. That they're ethnically were quite closely tied, and you saw that these tribes spread all the way across northern Europe, and they actually, up until there was a large insurgence of Roman imperialism, the French likewise were a German tribe. They were the Franks, and they had this common identity with all white Europeans, spanning from Eastern Europe to the Atlantic Ocean. It was largely just with the rise of Rome that you saw this Italian culture and language and Italian-Greek culture being imposed on Spain and France that saw this divide happen. Prior to that, we spoke basically the same language, we had basically the same culture, and another reason why you don't have the same rivalry between England as you do with Denmark is because they were so culturally similar for so long, whereas with France they weren't.
I also wonder if we have a common connection because of the Roman Empire, whereas Japan didn't ever go conquer China, and you never really had those. The Chinese Empire was destroyed at one point in time, and then they sort of grew out of that empire. Whereas in the West, that's what happened with the Roman Empire, and we sort of grew out of it as the Roman history, or the Roman Empire is sort of like our legacy, or it's sort of like this ancestral edifice.
Right. Well, China China itself is an empire, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Hero with Jet Li, but it just is an example of, it was a time period when China used to be made up of about 50 different tribes and kingdoms, and just one by one they conquered each other into this giant empire that spanned from sea to mountain range. You know, that's why it's so big. It has so many different ethnic tribes and languages within it. It is an empire of its own.
The other big factor, of course, is that Europe was united under Christendom to a certain extent
under religion.
as well. That was a huge thing, and that has really only broken. Well, I mean, it broke apart at various points. There was firstly the schism between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and then later the Protestant Reformation. But there was still the broad concept that Europeans were Christians, and that was a sort of a meta culture over the top of everything else.
And reactionary expat, like, you know, I mean, I know that you're not a Christian, but you know, you remind me a little bit of myself before, you know, I came back to the church. Even when I was an atheist, I respected Christianity, and that seems to have been largely the case, you know, up until, you know, the last century or so. Even people who, you know, didn't necessarily have a strong faith or maybe even any at all, still recognized that there was, you know, something positive about this that, you know, was underlying, you know, significant parts of the, you know, the structure upon which our societies are built, and that has just been completely eroded, and I just, you know, I always wonder that, you know, like, it's like, how much does this have to do with, you know, the state that we're in right now?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Christendom produced Bach, you know, produced Dostoevsky.
Yeah, and the Renaissance, and
there's an enormous amount of our culture, whether we're Christian or not, that was inspired by and produced for Christianity. So,
and you're not going to see that in Asia.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's Buddhism, but Buddhism is a very different kind of religion. It's far more. I think it's less hierarchical, and it's more dispersed.
And it's very detached, also.
Yeah.
Buddhism doesn't have any will to power like the monotheistic faiths. You know, there's no conquering spirit in Buddhism. You know, unlike Christianity or Islam. That's a huge difference.
There's no imperative.
Right. Yeah. That's the word I want. Thank you.
Well, what about Confucianism? I mean, I know that's not exactly a religion. It's sort of a secularized religion, kind of religionoid, but like that's sort of a unifying cultural thing for East Asia, isn't it?
I don't know if they I mean, obviously they recognize that within their own cultures, but I don't know to what extent they recognize themselves as therefore being closely tied to one another because of that. I mean, is it like saying there are a lot of countries in the world that are democracies, therefore, I don't know, Japan and Canada therefore have a lot in common because they're both democracies?
That's a good point. I think with like talking about Confucianism, it's a common theme, but not a unifying theme. East Asians still see themselves as very separate people. You know, even though like a racist stereotype, they all look the same. Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans see themselves as just almost different species of people. Took me a while to get my head around that.
Also, there's even tribalism within China, right? There's, you know, the Northerners always make fun of how the Southerners talk, and vice versa. And even one of the words that is commonly used to refer to the Chinese language, they say Hanyu, which is specifically the dialect of the Han tribe, which is the largest tribe in China, but still one among 50. A lot of people don't identify as Han tribe people. They feel like they've been forced to speak this language that's been imposed by this ancient empire.
Yeah, and Andrew was saying in the previous Hangout that it even goes so far in Korea as to result in, and again, I can't really speak to this, but this is what he said, that, you know, some Koreans who have a darker complexion are, you know, literally suffer discrimination from other Koreans.
Aren't they mostly immigrants from Southeast Asia? I think that's what that point was about.
Oh, was that what he said? Okay, I thought
think,
he said they were Koreans.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a hierarchy of skin tone here. I mean, there is in that it's not so much discrimination, but it's for women in particular. It's definitely perceived as being much more beautiful to be fairer, and so skin whitening creams and all of that sort of stuff are really big. I mean, that has its basis in sort of the labor that people used to do, whether they were manual laborers or not, and therefore it sort of has class associations.
Well, particularly in Thailand. Sorry.
A friend of mine is ethnic, traditional Taiwanese. He says his family goes back however many hundred years, and he actually has quite a lot of resentment towards kind of the Chinese ethnicity that came to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek or whoever, right? So there is kind of an oppressed indigenous Taiwanese people who don't like the Chinese that are there now. Sorry, you go ahead.
No, I was just talking about the skin tone thing, particularly in Thailand. I've heard Thai, when they speak English and they refer to people as white and black, they're not referring to European and African. They're referring to, lighter, darker skinned Thai. Just recently, maybe you guys have seen this, was it a couple weeks ago, there was a Thai TV commercial for a skin whitening cream, and the woman says, I guess translated from Thai, "I'm successful because I'm white." And all these white liberals just freaked out over the internalized racism. And like, no, this is just pale-skinned women are more attractive. You got to Google it. It's hilarious. The YouTube reactions, they're so angry.
That was in the US that ad showed, or?
No, it was a Thai TV commercial for a skin whitening cream, but somehow Western liberals, maybe an English teacher in Thailand, told his white friends. But it's hilarious. Yeah.
Did they get pissed off about the Star Wars poster recently? Like the
Chinese Star Wars poster?
Yeah.
Yeah, they put the black guy in the back. Yeah.
or they took him out. They were starving or something like that.
Oh no. Well, there was a thing in Taiwan a few years ago. There's a toothpaste brand called Darlie, D-A-R-L-I-E, and this toothpaste brand has actually gone through several iterations. It was called Darkie, and it had a picture of a sort of guy in blackface with a top hat on.
Oh, Lord.
A clearly African or African American face in a top hat and a suit, a tuxedo. And then it changed first to, I think it changed to a white man with, it was sort of in shadow, so you couldn't tell whether he was in blackface or it was shadow, but he had the same clothes and the same top hat. And then it changed to Dali. They changed the K to an L. But you can look this up on the internet and see the photos of how it's transitioned from a black guy with the word darky to a white guy with the word Dali. They just changed the K to an L. And that's because a lot of people got very upset about that over here, white people, I think. And in that same vein, at various points they've had some sort of gaffes here to do with Hitler. It's common for, well, not common, but I suppose it's common enough for people to have wedding photos in SS uniforms here. They do these wedding albums before the actual weddings, and so they have a number of photos in white wedding dresses and suits, and then they have sort of costumes. So people will dress up as a cowboy or samurai or something like that. And so you can find photos of people in SS uniforms for their wedding photos. And similarly, a couple of years ago, 7-Eleven had some little keychain mascot or something, and it was an Adolf Hitler vampire.
Nice.
I wish I'd picked one up at the time, actually. Probably be worth a lot of money now.
Back in Thailand, there was just a few years ago, it was a high school graduation where all the 18-year-old girls dressed up in SS uniforms, and they were marching down the promenade or whatever in their graduation ceremony. They were dressed up, and they had swastika flags, and just like the local English teacher, white guys, just lost it completely.
Yeah, people get pretty upset about that kind of stuff over here as well. Of course, the Israeli embassy complained, and I think that's why they ended up pulling the the Adolf Hitler vampire keychains over here. But yeah, I mean, it's just it's sort of, people don't even understand it a lot of the time. When I first met my wife, she was still a university student, and in her English class at university, the professor just assigned them each a country, and they had to do a talk on that particular country, or a PowerPoint presentation or something. So she asked me to have a look at hers, and hers was on Germany. And so on each of the pages for the PowerPoint presentation, she had a sort of a border around each page, and it was the current German flag, but with a swastika imposed upon it, because she had just chosen things that were German. She didn't really know what they were. She just chose some German things and put them on there. I said, you better not put that on there. Your English teacher might not really like that.
Too funny.
Well, speaking of, Asians and perception of race, and also how it kind of boomerangs back on white people of European ancestry is, before I really got into reactionary thinking, I remember one of the first times I met my fiance's mother, and she's got a pretty heavy Filipino accent, and I'm using my screen name here. I'm not going to dox myself, but she's like, "Oh, Lumen, do you have Indians in your country?" And I'm thinking, like, you hear Indians, you're thinking of like John Wayne movie or something. I don't know. And she's talking about Indians, and she's like, "Oh yeah, they smell," and it's Filipino people, are pretty resentful of Indians. They're young Indian professionals who have degrees, and they come in and they get into upper management and some of the offshore call centers and things like that. And it was one of my first hands-on experiences with, it's like, what, it's kind of normal to notice racial differences, and then going back to how this comes back to bite Western liberals sometimes is, I remember Manny Pacquiao, who was a huge hero for Pinoys, being fired from Nike because he didn't kiss the pinky ring of the gay mafia, and when asked about gay marriage, and this brown guy, who's pretty humble, and for the most part, especially compared to like Floyd Mayweather or something like that, and so it's the logical contortions of the left in their racial identity politics, instead of just being honest and going back to where we came from, which is just let's I hope the SPLC isn't somehow tuned into this, but calling a spade, this is what it is, and I'm going to call it that and have done with it.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was off topic.
Oh, no. Yeah, I think that this is all going to be a passing thing in the West. It's people can try to sweep these things under the rug. They're not going to be able to do this for that much longer, I think.
The luxury is going away.
And ironically, it's going away because of the left. I mean, look at a movement such as Black Lives Matter, where they're even coming out now and saying that there's no such thing as a white ally and that sort of thing. So they're sort of attacking leftist white people as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it occurred to me a while back. It's like they've pretty much gotten everything they wanted, but and they've even they've become the orthodoxy that they used to hate. And so how do you continue this? And the only way to do it is to invent things, invent enemies, and that's when even stupid people start getting it. People who aren't paying attention start getting it. It's like they're just inventing these straw men, and they couldn't be satisfied with having completely undermined Western civilization, and that's and you're right, reactionary expat. That's they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah, and especially as the if the West continues to have economic issues and sort of social divisions within the country, they're going to be less and less able to foist this upon people in other countries, such as in Asia. The Asians are going to say, we don't care, actually, and what can you do about it?
Right. My favorite thing about the Black Lives Matter movement is they're now demanding segregation. They say, separate us from these white people. We want, our own space.
Okay.
In the back of... Yeah, I said, okay, go for it.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I just... yeah, and I don't know. And actually, you find in Vancouver, we've got pretty much a section of the area that is entirely Indian, and a lot of the Indian families, especially if they're Hindu and traditional Hindu, they are completely against, race mixing, basically. And yeah, like you said, that they're kind of bringing it on themselves. So you've got these Black Lives Matter saying segregate us, and you've got these, traditional Asian cultures and populations coming in who also want to be segregated in their own way. It's a weird, contrast.
Yeah, and it's the only way it can end, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but it is kind of the what we're hearing a lot more about with the R and K selection in biological groups. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of fortuitous that it's happening at the same time that resources are just being depleted far faster than they can be replaced, and the absurdity theater of the left has just reached this feverish pitch, which is coinciding with more and more people demanding free stuff when there just isn't any, and it's just which is why I hope it can be resolved in a way that's not too bloody. Although I guess if it is a violent thing, that might make a better impression upon people to not be forgetful. Remember how it happened.
Jumping on that, I thought, like, specifically in 2015, because of Black Lives Matter and some of those student protests, it really divided and alienated the liberals in America. Like, even my friends who identify as liberal, they're like, oh, those people are crazy. Like, no, I'm not, I don't identify with that. Like, that crowd has gone so far.
They bum rushed Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah. But like, a lot of my liberal friends are suddenly having to make a stand, like, do we go full retard or do we pull back and be a little more reasonable? And I think some of my liberal friends are like, no, like, hate speech codes, that's ridiculous. And one guy in particular, a British liberal friend of mine, that black woman screaming at Yale, this is not about creating an intellectual space. That quote, it bothered him so much. He's like, well,
yeah, it's an unforeseen bout of self-awareness, I guess.
Yeah, like, wait a minute, I don't agree with that at all. And even liberals are kind of like, well, that's really crazy, So we'll see if the left kind of divides itself up a bit, or some crowd's going to go full retard. Don't worry, they'll keep going.
Well, that's already happened. You are seeing this fission, and I think the first step of the fission started in the atheist movement, right? Which was always very left-wing, and then you saw the feminist faction come in and kind of take over in it, and then suddenly it split in half because a lot of people aren't willing to go on with the feminist bandwagon, so that split, and now you're seeing this group that's in favor of social justice and racial justice and all that. They say equality for everyone, and then there's this other group saying, no, that's not enough. We want affirmative action and black segregation spaces. They're like, huh? Doesn't that go against what we've been saying for the past 30 years? I think it's a continuing split that we've been seeing for like a decade now, and it's just going to keep happening in every institution. It's going to be a divided, maybe even like a two-party, there'll be a three-party system where there's the Republicans and there's two different left-wing parties, like you see in Canada. We have one conservative party and two left-wing parties for the moderate left-wingers and the extremist left-wingers.
And it's essentially three liberal parties.
Mm-hmm.
When
Well,
it comes down. But meanwhile, in Asian countries, they don't suffer from this need to undermine a homogeneous society. They don't have to deal with this.
Now that's true. Like when I talk about Japanese politics, the Japanese left is still serving the country. Like what's good for Japan? Japanese liberalism is shutting down American bases or protecting Article 9 and avoiding war or increasing Japanese women's work participation levels, etc. It's never about gay marriage and more foreigners. They're still protecting. It's still protecting Japan. Excuse me.
Yeah, and that's utterly gone in the U.S. I mean, they're even when it existed, it wasn't very significant. And again, it comes down to it's not about preserving European identity. It's Americanism. And it's expedient. It's something to to maintain power or to grab power for a few years and pillage as much as you can and set up your heir.
Well, quick question about Japan. I know you said they weren't talking about gay marriage, but I remember seeing a story recently that there was some district or province or something in Japan where the demographics skew a bit younger and more liberal, and they actually said they were going to recognize gay marriages there or something like that. I don't know.
About an hour ago, I wanted to talk about that because I just read that. I think it was last month. Iga City, which is famous for ninjas, no connection whatsoever. Some Shinto shrine said they would recognize and perform same-sex marriages. There's no legal representation, but the Shinto shrine would perform same-sex marriages. So it's still a social acceptance, but not a legal acceptance. Because the religious ceremony in Japan has no legal binding. So, but it does seem to be like a camel's nose under the tent there. I don't know what's going on with that. Quite shocking. I was surprised. Gay marriage in Japan seemed so. No one predicted that.
Yeah, and that is something. When I started going to the Philippines, there's this famous ladyboy culture, and the weird thing is that it's still widely a conservative culture, but there's like this unspoken acceptance of homosexuality as long as it's not shoved in your face, as long as it's not made into a public spectacle as it is in Western countries. But that's changing, because right after the Supreme Court decision last June, my fiance's mother was telling me she was hearing it, that there are these Filipino LGBT groups that are pushing for it now, and it's a cancer, and it will unfortunately, at least in the Philippines, which isn't it's vastly different from China and Japan, Korea, but it will definitely erode away at their culture.
I know in Thailand for a long time, like they've had the ladyboy culture for a long time, coming from, I guess, India, but they weren't allowed to be English. They weren't allowed to be school teachers. Like there were still these legal blocks to them professionally.
Yeah, just common sense stuff.
Yeah, like we'll allow this to happen, but you can't, work in mainstream society. But that's starting to change a bit. Like I think they are legally allowing. I think on ID cards there's like a third gender option on Thai ID cards, or they're trying to push that through the parliament.
Come on, it's 2016.
Yeah, it's the current year. Come on.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything else to say on that? or shall we look at another topic?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Anyone else?
I think I'm gonna have to take off because I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning.
Sure. Okay. That's fine. Well,
Good night, Tom.
Night, guys. Nice meeting you all.
Yeah. Thanks.
Good night, man.
Have a
Good
good
to
one.
talk to you.
Someone wanted to say something?
No, saying have a good night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just saying goodbye.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. Let me just look at my list of questions. Okay. The iron rice ball culture. Would anyone like to talk about that? Does everyone know what that is? Perhaps I should explain that a little.
I don't know
I
what
didn't
that
know
is.
anything about it until
Please
you
explain.
talked.
Okay, I'll describe it first because maybe some of the people listening don't know what it is either. There's an actual term. In fact, I can look it up, or perhaps someone can find it. Actually, I'll just do it on Wikipedia very quickly. The iron rice bowl culture is essentially the idea that people who work for the government have an iron rice bowl. So they basically have they're never going to lose their meal, if you like. They're never going to be unemployed. They're never going to have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. And it's associated with a sort of very bureaucratic, unaccountable culture. It's quite similar to a lot of the same things that occur in the West with government jobs, but it's much more deeply institutionalized. And I think perhaps because it also goes back to the Mandarin exams in Imperial China. But it can be extremely frustrating to deal with this. Would anyone like to actually comment on that?
I mean, I'm not surprised, when you've got this country that's run by an undemocratic system where when you're in for life, and the government is self-regulating and self-appointing. It makes sense that if you're able to get a job in the government because you've got a connection to someone in the government, that you're pretty much set for life as long as you're on good terms with whoever's in charge, right?
Yeah, and it's really pushed here as a thing for children to do. Parents will really push their kids to get a government job. So much so that I've met a lot of people over here in Taiwan who have they've graduated from university and then they've gone to apply for a government job, and everything's done by exams. So even my brother-in-law, one of my brothers-in-law, he's a fireman at the airport, and he had to do a whole lot of exams to get that position. And some of these people, after they graduate, they'll take years. There's an exam every year, and they'll study for the entire year for an exam to become a teacher, for instance, or to get into some other government job. And if they don't get in, they'll just spend another year studying. And some of these people, in extreme cases, they're still doing this into their 30s, trying to get one of these jobs, and their parents push them really hard, or it's very acceptable for them to just spend 5 years studying for one of these exams on the off chance that they'll get to be a bureaucrat somewhere.
Right. Well, isn't that one of the leading causes of suicide being so great in a place like South Korea? Where I remember seeing that during exam season in South Korea, because they've got that big standardized exam, that suicide rates just skyrocket because so many students fail the exam and think my life is over, and just because it's all tied to one or two exams, for getting into a good school or getting into a steady job. And it's usually done in such a regimented way where it's seasonal or it's annual, where you basically work at it for a whole year, for how many years, and then the year comes and you fail, and then you've at least got to waste another year of your life if you haven't screwed yourself over completely.
Yeah, I can only say that it kind of reminds me of what we have here, at least in America. The iron coexist bumper sticker that people in academia aspire to, where if you can avoid saying anything that could remotely be interpreted as racist, you get tenure, for the rest of your life. And I'm just kidding, of course, but it makes sense, in a country where this is the center of existence, working for the government, and when it's so regimented and it's difficult to get into it, that carries a lot of esteem. In a lot of European cultures, it used to be like a singular point of pride if your son became a priest, and especially in like Florence or Brussels, whatever, a city. I hadn't heard of this until you mentioned it tonight, Reactionary Expat, but and I can see how regular Chinese who could never hope to get a position like this would respect it, if it's clear that this is part of the fabric of society. This makes us great, having these people, and it is interesting, but it makes sense to me.
Well, it has become a point of contention in Taiwan in recent years because the benefits for some of these Iron Ricebowl employees were unbelievable. For instance, until only a couple of years ago, teachers, I think it was only junior high school teachers and elementary school teachers. I don't know why senior high school teachers weren't part of this, but those other teachers, they didn't pay tax. They also, and that applied to foreigners as well. I didn't pay tax in my job until only, I think it was the last year when I was in that job, the last 1 or 2 years. They also had guaranteed loans at a fixed rate. It was guaranteed that it would be at a fixed rate of, I think it was 1.5% or 1.8% or something like that for houses. And the really big thing, I don't know the full details of this, but as to whether there was a cap on this or not, but they had a guaranteed return on retirement investments of 18% per annum. As I say, I don't know whether there was a cap on that, but 18% means that their money would double every 4 years. So you can imagine.
So it becomes cronyism.
Oh yeah, it was crazy. It was these people became a huge block, and the rest of well, it wasn't so much cronyism because you had to pass these exams to get in, but once you got in, you were in. That was the whole point of it being an Iron Ricebowl. And there was a lot of resentment by ordinary Taiwanese because the Taiwanese economy had stagnated and wages and salaries weren't increasing, and yet you had some of these teachers were retiring after 25 years. You could retire after 25 years, so 47. And they had these unbelievable benefits. There were some families where both of the adults and maybe they lived with their parents as well, one set of parents, so there could be 4 people in the same household, and they were drawing tens of thousands of US dollars per month in benefits in retirement, compared to the average person who's getting $1,000 per month in their job. And so they've started cutting back on a lot of these things. But you can see why it was very attractive to get into this kind of thing.
Well, and that's a big difference between the West and the East. Here it just gets worse, and you don't have to pass you don't have to go through a stringent vetting and testing process to do it.
Well, the testing process was really sort of strange. For instance, to become a teacher, you had to do a big exam on theory and all of this sort of stuff, but there was no practical component to that. There was no sort of observational component. And there was a lot of that generally within the public sector, in that technically it's meritocratic, but it doesn't necessarily assess the right things for these people. So yeah, it was a huge thing, and I think it's sort of petering out now because they're pulling the system apart.
Did you see that spawn from like a labor union movement? Because we do see a fair bit of that in places like Canada and Britain, where they've got just huge gains by labor movements. Or was this just given directly from the government?
It was directly from the government. In fact, one of the really strange things about Taiwanese culture until recently was that of the two parties, the Nationalist Party, which is, I suppose, more right-wing, they had completely captured the vote of government workers, most government workers, which is sort of the opposite of how it is in the West, where government workers tend to be left wing. And that was precisely because they had given them all these benefits, and I think they had done that ever since they had assumed power, or with them fleeing over here. It probably has its roots in Imperial China. I don't know, but I think that has certainly been the case ever since they've been in Taiwan. The government workers, the military, teachers, and so on have always had really good benefits, or had until recently. And so when Taiwan became a democracy, those people were very loyal to the nationalist government, the right-wing government, even when the left wing got in power. Once before, the government workers were still very pro-KMT, very pro-right-wing, which is very unusual. But it didn't come out of the labour movement. In fact, I think labour unions are somewhat illegal, if not illegal, here.
That's really interesting. Huh.
Yeah, it's a pretty strange set of circumstances here. I think it's changing a lot now, and I assume that a lot of people who work for the government probably voted for the DPP yesterday, the left-wing party, because they got in with 60% of the vote. So I imagine they would have had to get a fair number of people who work for the government, and that's probably because those people think, well, I'm no longer getting benefits from the KMT, so I might as well vote for the DPP.
Right. If you don't mind me asking, you as an immigrant to Taiwan, are you allowed to vote?
No, I'm not. And indeed, to become a citizen here, you have to renounce your current citizenship. Of course, you can reapply for that later on, but for them, for instance, if a Taiwanese person goes to the West, they can have dual citizenship, and many do, of course. But for me, I would have to renounce my Australian citizenship and then become a Taiwanese citizen and then possibly reapply for Australian citizenship. It's pretty uncommon for people to do that here, obviously.
It's the same in mainland China as well, where you have to be a Chinese citizen and pretty much nothing else. I don't even think they allow like Chinese citizens, if they're from China, to have dual citizenship. If they go to another country and gain citizenship, I think they pretty much make you pick one or the other, regardless of where you're from. So yeah, it would make sense that Taiwan is, a slightly milder version of that.
Right. Yeah. Lots of people here have two passports. Then some of them come back here to do military service, some don't, and people come in under different passports for different reasons if they have two passports. All sorts of stuff like that. And every so often there are sort of issues. People will say that this politician or that politician, he has dual citizenship, or they'll say, his family does. I mean, certainly a lot of family members of politicians do, and there are always corruption issues about spiriting money abroad and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, why do you think one reason why there's so many of these billionaires and millionaires in China buying summer homes and sending their family over into Vancouver, Canada? Because it's a great place to store your money and get around Chinese regulation.
Yeah, someone is saying in the chat that he thinks that the idea that Chinese can't have dual citizenship doesn't sit right with the idea of anchor baby tourism to the US.
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I know at least the friends I knew who are studying at university in Canada, none of them are Canadian citizens. They still have their Chinese citizenship. They're just, here on student visas or what have you. And they seem to be under somewhat of the impression that it's a bit more of an either-or. I could be wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know specifically with regard to China. I really only know about Taiwan. Taiwan's sort of a strange place because it's a country that's not a country, but it effectively is a country. They issue their own passports even though they don't have embassies or consulates. They call them Taiwan Economic and Cultural Offices or something like that. So
right, yeah.
They do different things to China, so I can't really comment upon China.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a complicated issue given how much China imposes on Taiwan, and again considers Taiwan to be a province of China. It's not always clear on what laws that are more libertarian and laissez-faire come from Taiwan, and which ones that are a bit more draconian are actually being imposed on them by China and saying, if you don't follow this, we're gonna invade you again.
But Taiwan more or less functions as an independent country. It hasn't declared formal independence, and it's not in certain organizations. Like it used to be in the UN, and then it's not now.
I believe it was Reagan who changed that because he kind of saw the rising of China. I think it was but it was during the time when the debate was going on about the one China policy. The idea there can only be one China. It's either going to be Taiwan or mainland China, and the United States chose mainland China because it's the bigger economic ally.
But didn't it begin with Nixon recognizing China in 19?
That was it. Nixon.
Yeah, when he went there.
71, I think. And then
Nixon also took us off the gold standard. Thanks, Dick.
and then after that, Taiwan threw a bit of a hissy fit over that. And if I remember correctly, they actually sort of departed from the UN. But so the only way in which China really holds any sort of sway as such is that they restrict their entry into various organizations, and even things like sporting events. Taiwan has to call itself Chinese Taipei, but in terms of everything else, Taiwan pretty much functions as an actual country. They issue their own passports, they make trade deals with other countries and so on.
Right.
I mean, of course, China tries to lean on them for certain things, but they have their own domestic laws and the international relations and so on.
And it almost seems like the Chinese, in a way, kind of use Taiwan to, from time to time, look good to the international community, especially the U.S. It's like, they can lean on them and come across as kind of menacing, and then kind of, walk that back a little bit, and they've made their point, and they also look like there's been some fairness.
But on the other hand, sorry, just going back a bit, reactionary. Taiwan, when Taiwan enters the Olympics, they can't call themselves Taiwan. They call themselves something Taipei.
Well, Taiwan wouldn't actually call itself Taiwan anyway. It would call itself the Republic of China.
Yeah.
But they don't do that. No, they have to call themselves Chinese Taipei. They have a special emblem that they use. It's not the nationalist flag that is the flag of the Republic of China. It's it's like a flower or something. It's sort of a 5-point. Oh, it's not points. It's curves. It's like a 5-petaled flower or something with something in the middle. So yeah, they can't call themselves the Republic of China.
Okay.
At sporting events. Yeah, that's a big thing. And China sometimes tries to latch on to Taiwanese people. Anyone who sort of achieves anything, they try to latch on to them, or they try to silence them. In fact, one factor that people are saying was a big factor in the election yesterday was recently there was a Taiwanese singer, and she's part of a Korean pop band, one of those girl groups, and she took a photo of herself recently holding a Korean flag and a Taiwanese flag, a Republic of China flag, and another musician who's from Taiwan but who's very pro-China heavily criticized her, and this was interpreted broadly as a kind of the way in which China or its proxies attempt to silence Taiwanese nationalism. And so that was seen as a kind of a tipping point, or something that really caused a lot of people who normally would have voted for the Nationalist Party, who are sort of increasing relations with China. A lot of people who normally would have voted for them for all sorts of issues to do with economics and so were quite alarmed at that, or that sort of was emblematic or typical of the way China or its proxies tried to influence Taiwan, and people are saying that was a really major factor in sort of illustrating that problem and tipping
Right,
people over to
heard
voting
about
against
that.
them.
I remember she had to release a public statement saying,
Yeah.
"I'm sorry," and there is only one China, and it is mainland China, something to that effect, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, public apology, and it was a big hoo-ha, and people here, politicians said she shouldn't have had to do that, and so on and so forth, and it became a real lightning rod for anti-Chinese feeling here, and they think that was quite a decisive factor in the election yesterday.
I remember a little while ago there was that discrepancy between Japan and China over those islands kind of at the south of Japan,
and also Taiwan.
Who owns them?
Yeah, Taiwan also has a claim on them. The Senkaku or the Diaoyu.
Yeah, exactly. The Senkaku Islands. The funny thing about that is, at least as I heard it reported, the first people to the islands, they were Taiwanese Chinese, but they were kind of mainland nationalists. What they did is they took a boat up there and stuck a flag in the ground, a Chinese flag, to kind of claim the islands. But then next to it, they stuck in a Taiwanese flag as well. Now, when it was reported, and of course the Japanese nationalists had also come over and stuck a Japanese flag. So when it was reported all over mainland China, you saw the Japanese flag and the Chinese flag on these islands, but they had blacked out the Taiwanese flag.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, China is pretty big on appearances, and I remember over here how President Obama made the Dalai Lama go out the back door, like past the garbage, where the Chinese premier was quite visible and dignified when he visited. Did I break the chat?
Reactionary Expats having some mic problems, it seems, so yeah.
No, actually, I was going to say in Japan, that's all over the news, the argument about the islands. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. I haven't been following it much, but yeah, that was all over the 6 o'clock news here.
And that's what I mean by appearances. It's like, do they really need the islands? No. But when they can. When they can engage in some saber rattling and look good, and I mean it's power. It's power, I guess.
But wasn't there supposed to be some oil on one of those islands, or they suspect there's oil?
I think it was, at least they didn't know it at the time. It was mainly just the communists. Their claim to their claim to legitimacy is spawned directly from anti-Japanese sentiment.
Okay.
So every few years they have to come up with something to get the Chinese people mad at Japan in order to restake their claim as the rightful rulers of China. And this was a perfect case.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, if they found oil there now, I bet you China's already built a refinery, let's say.
Well, because a few of us English teachers, a few of us Westerners in Japan, we were noticing this, and we kind of said that, East Asians are really nationalistic. They're really stubborn. They're going to argue like crazy over these stupid islands. They're finally going to make a decision somehow. But East Asians are also really risk averse. They're not going to actually they're not going to invest in looking for oil. They're probably going to get some Western venture capitalists to actually go in there and dig for oil. So, but in the meantime, saber rattling, yeah, we'll just be arguing over stupid islands.
Yeah, and it's similar. Apparently, according to my fiance's father, like once, I don't know if it was actually the Filipino government or a foreign entity, but there was some pretty big. It was either oil fields or natural gas fields found in the South China Sea near the Philippines, and that's supposedly when they started hanging out a little bit more down there. I'm just going to stop talking. Every time I talk, the chat stops.
You kill it, man. You're killing it.
Well, we're just also speechless from your
Yeah,
brilliance.
your brilliance. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you couldn't see me.
No, I was just typing. I was going to say something. I forgot what it was, but I was just typing something to someone, so I didn't want everyone to hear. You know, tap 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 tap.
Well, thanks for having us, Reactionary Expat.
Yeah, I actually have to start winding it up simply because I need to go out with my wife and do some stuff for one of our businesses. But yeah, it's been fantastic. I think these two have worked really well. The quality's been really good, and you guys have had some very interesting perspectives on things. I think, well, firstly, there's another one next week that's only going to be probably me and 2 or 3 other people, because it's going to be a specific Taiwan-focused hangout. But I'd like to do some of these again for sure. I'm going to be in Australia for most of February, so probably not until March, I think. But that'll give us enough time to have some more current events and people can think of topics and stuff. But yeah, it's been really good. So I'd love to have any or all of you back again. And hopefully next time Dolph can speak as well, if he can sort out a mic issue. And also, Zai, if in the future you can sort out your microphone a little bit better, that would be good.
Oh, yeah,
Also,
I'd love to be back, and I promise you I'll be getting another mic apart from this.
all right, well, great. So I'll just wrap up then. All right, well, thank you everyone who has participated and listened. And please tune in next week. There'll be another one on Saturday, the 23rd. It will be 11 a.m. GMT, so 11 a.m. in London, essentially. It's 7 o'clock in the evening here in Taiwan on Saturday. I'm not sure what the time would be in various places in North America, but 11 a.m. GMT next Saturday, the 23rd. I hope you can all tune into that one. It's going to be specifically about Taiwan. Hopefully I will have Chris from last night and also John Matrix from last night. And there's one other guy, an Australian guy with a Taiwanese connection. Hopefully those 3 will be there. They're all quite interesting characters. So once again, thank you for participating and listening. And that's the end.
Thanks. God bless.
Yeah, thank you.
My
everyone.
pleasure. Thanks, guys. Stay in
Thank
touch.
you.
Do it again.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Over and out.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.